Right, hopefully that's put up something for you guys. So I'm getting a stream of chats coming through. Normally, Chris would be talking away, and I would be the one that's providing the background eyes on the crowd. So hopefully everybody can see the screen now, which shows the Global Network on Sustainability in Space. And the presentation today is coming to you from both ourselves at Northern Space and Security, NORS for short, and with help from Northumbria University. Northumbria University have done the vast majority of the work in this, and will be doing the vast majority of the legwork as we delve into the sustainability Sustainable Development Goals. I'd also like to point out, Lauren, could you introduce yourself before you do your piece, rather than me waffling? It'd be good to for you to let the crowd know exactly who you are. So the Global Network on Sustainability in Space is a SDFC funded organization that has been funded to bring together scientists and industry to understand and solve problems relating to operations in space. So not just the ever-growing population of space debris, but also the challenges of safety of flight and ensuring that long-term benefits of space are maintained. At the bottom of this slide, and I will add it to a slide at the, later on in the event, and I'll also drop it into the chat, you will see a link to this workshop's page on the GNOSIS website, and that is for feedback, please. And I ask you all to utilize that at the end of the event to help us improve how we present these forwards. And believe you me, my presentation technique will need a lot of improvement after today, but so any constructive direction is welcomed. But GNOSIS holds a number of events every year, and all that information is on the website, and from which they generate potential research work for the challenges of safeguarding space. And Dr. Stuart Eaves will be in touch, we'll talk to you at the end of the event and present about the GNOSIS challenges. I won't go into any more information there, but there are a number of challenges out there for academia and industry to join to help develop innovative ideas to solve the problems related to space debris and the challenges of safeguarding spacecraft. The problem we have is the utilization of space environment for day-to-day culture. We're not just talking about military use. The focus is constantly on the military use, but space is ever increasingly becoming part of our day-to-day life. I mean, you see helping us support us do this event today, which is maybe a good thing or a bad thing, who knows. Interestingly, the total number of active satellites has increased. Not necessarily the number of space debris in relation is not increasing as it has done in the past as such an alarming rate, but the risk for that to occur is always there. You know, the famous 3 Cs that have been rolled out over a number of decades almost now, the congested, contested, and competitive nature of space has led to a number of significant events in recent years, both militarily, with the development of what they're now calling space domain awareness, with a lot of talk on nefarious acts in space, but also there's been a huge increase in commercialization of space, particularly from one individual, to be honest, from Elon Musk and SpaceX, and the fact that over the past 2.5 years, he's launched something in the region of just under 1,800 satellites onto Earth orbit, and less than 100 of those have either failed or decayed since then. So there's around about 1,700 new objects from one operator alone. And of course, there's the usual cadence of launches around that as well. So the orbital population has significantly increased in recent years. So not only are we talking about helping to use benefit, I mean, Elon Musk is there trying to provide us with the internet from space. So space is now being used to provide broadband to some far-reaching places. But of course, it's maintaining that resource, i.e. space, so that we can keep on doing this. So that is the important thing of bringing us together. And these are the challenges that we face both as a society and obviously specifically as GNOSIS as an organization to try and help fix. We won't be stopping the use of space, therefore we need to use it better. I suppose the simplest way to talk about that is. But before that happens, and I've sort of talked through the broad need and the UK need. I won't even touch on because we'll obviously be talking about that as we go through this. Before that happens, I'll just give you a little information on my background and who Northern Space and Security are. We were founded in 2017, basically as a consultancy, as a retirement project for me as I left the military, and have subsequently grown in size, understanding, and for want of a better phrase, strength. We deal with space surveillance and tracking, we deal with space situational awareness, and we're able to support space domain awareness. And space domain awareness is just a phrase that was introduced, an SSA on steroids militarily to support, as the US military stated 2 years ago, the focus on space superiority and dominance of the space domain. So there are some connotations and space domain awareness of being space superiority, of being a space force, rather than necessarily being space for all. Whereas space situational awareness has been there to provide some good thoughts and some ideas historically on what's going into, coming out of, and happening in space, and trying to collate events that are occurring. But it's far from being controlled or managed. So this is probably one of the ways forward, that we have to look at how we utilize space better. But one of the key elements, what people don't realize, is we know so little about what's going on in space. It's very stovepiped, for want of a better phrase. So what I'm going to do now is hot off the press, if I can get this to work, is actually show you a promotional video, which probably captures a lot of not only what NORS does, but actually more importantly what we were going to be talking about today. Go. Just got a message to say that sound's not playing. Just give me a second. Right, hopefully you can see the screen again.
Space. It's big. Mind-boggling to wrap your head around. Just whopping swathes of emptiness peppered by clumps of dust, stars, black holes, radiation, and more emptiness. But there is this tiny bit from just 100 kilometers up that's vital to how we live. That's where satellites operate. The world is run by them as they orbit above the Earth. We wake, check apps, the temperature, wind direction, rainfall. We use them to beat traffic, find a restaurant, shop from the couch, do our banking. They beam down what we watch, listen to, hear about, and they bring us together wherever we might be in the world. Space. We're more reliant on it than ever. But the more we shove up there, the more clogged it gets. Collisions happen, big bangs, satellites clanging into each other at 17,000 miles per hour, causing fragmentation, space junk, space waste, space pollution, space trash, debris, defunct artificial objects floating around in Earth's orbit. Imagine a life with no telly, no phones, no defense, no weather warnings. the sky's not falling in just yet. But we can only understand what's going on up there if we can measure it. We're NORSE, specialists in space situational awareness, SSA. If it's up there, we can map it, understand how it's behaving. We're curious humans that deal in data, looking for truth, observing everything above our heads to help people operate safely in orbit. No other UK company operates in the space we do, watching, coding, understanding, reacting super fast, developing our own platforms, projects and sensor systems, mapping areas of the sky not mapped before, tackling new dimensions, keeping space safe, keeping you safe. What we observe, we bring back down to Earth, because space is for everybody, so we need to take care of it, make it sustainable for future generations, and take responsibility now. Space. It's big.
Charlie Brown, Houston, they got staging. They had a wild gyration, though, but they got it under control. Over.
You'll have to exclude our blatant advertising, but this is a work in progress, trying to capture a lot of the stuff that we are involved in to try and make it as understandable
Space.
to others. Sorry about that. I don't need to say it again. Our vision is to be the best end-to-end space situational awareness and domain awareness provider that there is, not just in the UK, but that takes time and more important, takes experience. NORSE is a team of 16 now. It began as a retirement project from when I left the Air Force, but became a team of 16 and we're soon to expand further. We have our own sensors, which are placed out at not only at Kielder in Northumberland, but also at other locations in the northeast and not far from Reading as well, to take our own data of objects from space. And it's a cost-effective, commercial off-the-shelf camera alternative to radar, for want of a better phrase. Yes, there are drawbacks, but it provides us with additional data to support what we do and develop the experience. It takes a minimum of 10 years of experience to really understand a lot of the stuff that's happening in there, up in space, and what more importantly, what's happening for the specific role of being a space surveillance and tracking practitioner. And therefore, we've got a young team of engineers that myself and my colleagues are hopefully passing our experience onto and developing them and bring them forward. And we even created the first ever space orbital analyst apprenticeship, who is progressing through New College Durham at the moment. So we've expanded up to, we've just got 2 more new staff arriving fairly soon. We are based in the northeast, but we have our offices all over the country, recognizing the significance of the space cluster at Harwell. We got an early office there, but we are dedicated to bringing experience of activities in space to the northeast so that we can help generate future skill sets and employment for the future. And we just have opened this morning our office at the Orbit building at Net Park, which was the location we had hoped to host the hybrid part of the event before I got tested positive for COVID and ended up in this nice little cell in the house. And hence why it's all online. And I'll leave that picture in your mind, because I won't go into any great depth on the northeastern space yet. Both hopefully Elaine Scott will be able to speak for a few minutes on the Northeast Space Hub developments, and the concept idea of NESI is something that we will talk about later. On our slide, it shows for a very small company of only 18, we have an awful lot of connections. What it does miss on there, and I apologize to Durham profusely, is my colleague didn't put Durham University. We actually also have a postdoc researcher from Durham that's working with us, looking at how we can do things better, because the way space traffic has been managed in the past, or the way SSA has been managed, is very much stuck in the we've always done it that way realm. And needs to look way forward. So working in locations like Net Park, working with people like Northumbria and Durham, and in the future Newcastle. And we also are advertising for a master's student at the University of South Wales as well at the moment. We're hoping to extend that network and extend that understanding and develop those skill sets to support the way forward. And that's why it's so important to us to be part of the GNOSIS network and work alongside them, help promoting GNOSIS and help promoting space situational awareness and the importance and benefits of space that do occur. That's just a brief snapshot of our setup. In the top right-hand corner, you can see the Kielder Observatory, a great charity organization that brings astronomy to the masses, for want of a better phrase. The guy that came up with the original concept probably won't mind me because I did read it in his biography, but it took a football hooligan to bring astronomy to the northeast of England. It's probably being a bit disingenuous to the rest of those involved, but he does talk about it in his biography quite a bit. But it's very important to understand that space is for all, whether it's the stars or the satellites. And our camera network is set up actually alongside the Kielder Observatory, where we take observations of satellites at the same time that our colleagues at Kielder are introducing the public to the stars. So it's a great event. But on that note, I will stop the crass promotion of Northern Space and Security and actually come across to the focus of today's event, and that is to view the Sustainment Development Goals through the lens or lenses of space enhancement. Space Force enhancement was a key part of space control when back in 8 years ago, when the Air Force actually had a strategy on space, and we're waiting for the next MOD or defense space strategy. But space enhancement is what space is, how space supports life today. And we want to make sure that benefit remains for the future. So the whole idea of today, through the help of Lauren, is to explore the how, why, and when the sustainment of space can support the sustainment development goals, and more importantly, in our community's view, how, why, and when the sustainment of space should actually become an SDG itself, and to talk through any thoughts and ideas people have about how we project that to COP26 next month. So I will stop this slideshow, and hopefully technology will allow me to allow Lauren to share the screen. You should
actually
already
able to do so already.
Yeah.
Let me just test it out. So should be able to see the slides. Okay, so I've got half an hour. Just want to make sure I don't go over time.
Now, please can I remind everybody as well, this is a time, it's not just for Lauren to talk at you, but this is to set the scene, but it is also for your participation to add points and help her and help direct the subsequent discussions.
Are you ready for me to start?
All yours, Lauren.
All right. Sorry, it's hard to, when you share a screen, you can't see the Zoom anymore. Anyway, my name is Lauren Napier. I am a PhD researcher under Professor Chris Newman at Northumbria University, and my focus is on sustainability of low Earth orbit. But that also means that I, from time to time, look at how space can support sustainable development goals, which is why I've been asked to help today. So just to overview, I think we kind of already spoke about this a little bit anyway, but we've got it broken up where I'm going to just give you a quick whistle-stop tour of how space can support sustainable development and why it's so critical that we do so. And then we can go into answering some questions for the breakout, or as it may be, just open floor discussion. So from my perspective, doing my research, because my research is on the sustainability of low Earth orbit, and I look at the governance aspect from an international perspective. The way I frame it is, if Earth's orbit, specifically low Earth orbit, is not sustainably used, then all of the satellites that do Earth observation and use remote sensing could potentially become damaged, or let's say they could have collisions, and then we're not able to actually perform the duties that need to be performed to support the Sustainable Development Goals through the use of Earth observation. So it's kind of the idea that the more sustainable, especially low Earth orbit is, the more we are able to actually help with these socioeconomic and environmental issues on Earth. So the key issues to think about that are kind of the threads running throughout is that we need space sustainable for the SDGs. And then we need to be able to capacity build or knowledge share on how space can support sustainable development goals. There's a United Nations initiative, which I'll get to in a minute, called Space for SDGs. And that's kind of the overarching point. But especially in industry, it would be incredible to see more use of this, whether it's on the website or through social media, kind of supporting the fact that a lot of people outside the space sector either don't know the space, how space exists and how we work, or they don't realize that satellite imagery and data can be used for the sustainable development goals. So that's where I think we need to kind of build our capacity here and knowledge share. And lastly, there could be, for example, especially emerging space countries that are typically from the global south. They may have limited resources accessing space. So how can we support those that might want to utilize space but don't have the resources to do so, but still have large sustainable development goal challenges in their home countries? And so the workshop was for us relevant because COP26 is approaching, and it's good. Of course, a lot of what we talk about with sustainable development does feed into the issue of climate change. It's also important that the international space community is responding to Earth challenges and that we should articulate this, like I said, not just within the space community, but outside of it. And that's done through the Space for SDGs initiative and the draft Space 2030 agenda. And then after we kind of go through all of this, there will be a break, and then we will have open discussion. And I've got a couple of questions to kind of get you thinking. So I may pop those up in the break so you can start thinking. And what we're hoping is that we can generate some recommendations and some actionable ideas, because a lot of time, there's a lot of talk around how space can support sustainable development and how we can support space being sustainable, but we don't really come up with any actionable ideas. So I don't know if everyone knows all of the sustainable development goals, but we've put this slide up just so you can get an overview. I'll talk a lot about 13 climate action just because of COP26, but I'm also going to talk a lot about 16 and 17 because in my opinion, the fact that we need peace, justice, and strong institutions, as well as partnering for the goals, kind of underpins all the rest of them. So I like to think of 16 and 17 as supporting all the others. And what we'll find when I kind of give you a little focus on 13 is that in the end, while all of them may have unique specific targets and things that need to be done, the way that they're discussed is very similar. So you may be thinking also how can space be supporting these? Of course, you know, having the discussion today could even be part of full quality education. We're educating about space and the use of space for sustainable development. There's a lot of different things that kind of come into this. You know, the fact that we've got space organizations in the UK that is growing the space industry also means growing jobs, which also means, as Jen was talking about, having, you know, post-grad opportunities and internships, which does also help with quality education. So it's all kind of together. The space industry has different ways it can support the sustainable development goals. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about 13. When you go on the website for the United Nations and you just Google SDGs, there's a page and you can click on each one and you can see all the targets. But what I found interesting was that these keywords kept coming up. And the things that I thought were the most interesting was resilience and adaptability. So anytime we're talking about goals, we need to be able to be resilient and we need to be able to adapt to what's around us to do the best that we can to reach the targets of the goals. That means a lot of implementation of technology, implementation of, you know, research and design, implementation of policies and regulations that could benefit the sustainable development goals or accomplishing the goals. And like we're doing today, education and awareness raising, just getting the message out that sustainable development goals still have aspects that need to happen to be able to meet the goals, and then how space can play a role there. and always keeping in mind the needs of the developing countries, because those are the countries that might need the most in terms of support with knowledge sharing and resources. And that goes through capacity building. So being able to build them up through the use of knowledge sharing and training to get them to be able to be self-sufficient to support the goals. What's interesting is that these overarching themes are not specific to SDG 13. You find them running fluid throughout all of the goals. So that's why I chose to highlight these topics rather than talking about the technical and scientific aspects of climate action. All the SDGs can intertwine. So for example, if we're talking about climate action, we're probably also going to be monitoring weather and water, and we'll be, let's say monitoring the Arctic Circle and so on. And all of those kind of build together with life below water, life on land. Of course, then you've got aspects like there's one on sustainable cities. Sustainable cities can also connect to having clean water and sanitation, having the ability to have building your economy and your working community and things like this. So I find that they all kind of intertwine and can support one another. So sometimes your activities might check off more than one goal. So overall, how do they connect to space? So like I said, I like to think of 16 and 17 as kind of the underpinning chart goals that we have. And the way we're doing it is from the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs has an initiative called Space for SDGs. And they run, they're the secretariat for the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And those of you that may not be familiar with the UN system, the committee is where all member states come together to deliberate on issues and find consensus to create reports, guidelines, treaties, to other international documents. And they meet 3 times a year. So just you have a science and technical, which is very, very expert on space weather, near Earth objects and things like this, and legal subcommittee, which is really talking more about the policies and the laws and regulations that need to be applied to space. And then I put down a list of relevant agenda items that I thought really encompass how space is supporting the SDGs and how that discussion looks. So for example, there are actually agenda items that do talk about space and climate change and space and water, and even space and global health. So there's a lot of different ways that states and permanent observers, which would be international organizations, can come together and discuss at the UN level how space can support sustainable development. And on top of that, we then also think about how space in turn needs to stay sustainable so that we can do our job to support Earth for socioeconomic and environmental issues. So there's something new. There's the 2030 agenda, which is a UN-wide initiative. Well, space decided to have the same. So at the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs through the committee, they have Space 2030 agenda, which unfortunately is still only in draft mode, but it's moving forward. And the Space 2030 agenda is specifically focusing more on how space can support sustainable development goals. So you see these same keywords coming in again. We're talking about capacity building. We're talking about knowledge sharing. We're talking about inclusion of not just state, but non-state actors, so organizations, academia, commercial sector. We're talking about data sharing and having research and design and innovation that can come together to kind of help each other figure out ways to improve the quality of life. And then the great thing is as well, they also, similar to what we're doing today, they'll host events, and then they'll have different kind of documentation online that can kind of support different groups of people that might need to be working on how they can support sustainable development goals with the use of space technology. So of course, there's organizations, not-for-profits, projects, academia, programs. There's all kinds of different ways to get the encouragement of participation and cooperation in this. So just briefly, because my background and Professor Newman, who is going to be here, is space law, I just wanted to show that all of this is then underpinned by the Outer Space Treaty, which is the guiding legal instrument for how space activities should be conducted. And so the fact that we have one that says that space should be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all states, which states means countries, and countries then means their citizenry, regardless of economic and scientific development. So right there in the first article, we're suggesting that space is for everyone and it needs to benefit everyone. And at the time, they were thinking this because they didn't want to have a Cold War in space or a post-Cold War war in space. But really, in today, this could also be understood to mean benefiting all of us back on Earth through the use of space technology as well. So that led us to 1986, the principles relating to remote sensing from outer space. So again, they reiterate that it's in the benefit and interest of everyone. We need to promote international cooperation, which is knowledge sharing and capacity building. We need to promote protection of the Earth environment and share that information, which feeds right into the Sustainable Development Goals, and then promote the protection of humanity from natural disasters and share that information, which is definitely becoming more of an issue with the climate crisis, specifically where I'm from in Florida, where we have multiple hurricanes, tropical storms a year, for example. So they already were kind of forward thinking even in the 80s, but it's loose interpretation, which is why then we have the Space 23 agenda as well. So applications, I just want to show, like, this is a satellite image from NASA, and it kind of shows how we can track different things. I'm sure you've seen many of these. Maybe you work for organizations that are already doing this. But for example, if we look at climate action, we're thinking about climate change monitoring, weather forecasting, disaster management, search and rescue operations. And this could be on a national level, international level, local level. There's just a lot of different ways that space data and imagery can support tracking what's happening on Earth. There are also, I know that there are initiatives to track deforestation, to track, the water saliency in high seas, to track the, as this picture shows, the declining ice caps, to show migration of animals and how they are being affected by climate change. So there's a lot of different things that are going into, coming from space applications that are supporting Sustainable Development Goals. So I know I just went through really quickly, but I'd like to have some time for you to think about the questions, and then maybe we can, if you have any questions for me before we jump into that, and I think we're supposed to have a break. So I think we've got 10 minutes until the break. If I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat and everything. But if you've got questions about how space supports sustainable development, or how we could work on making space more sustainable to continue to use space for Earth observation, these are kind of the points we were thinking before we jump into the workshop discussion later. So let me see, I've seen that there's some chat.
Lauren, could I ask you a question?
Please.
So you've obviously talked quite a bit about one of the particular goals, but it seems to me that there are inevitably going to be linkages between them. So if I can just give an example of the sort of thing that I'm wondering about. I think goal 3 was to do with health and well-being. And one of the sort of products from satellite data is the way that the Earth's climate is changing, and temperatures are changing in different regions. And I've seen maps like that used to indicate the future spread of conditions that might be suitable for malarial mosquitoes to live, for example. So it seems that there are linkages between the various sustainable development goals, and satellites could contribute kind of to one of the objectives via another in some ways. Are you actively trying to map linkages like that to see if there are other sort of candidate opportunities to satisfy more than one at a time, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, actually, so me personally and the work I'm doing, no, but I do know that there is, I will preface by saying there is a crossover in the UK of people that are studying international development and space. So just what you're saying, I actually have a colleague at Open University discussing how you can use space applications to help support the spread of diseases in various countries. So there are people out there working more towards sustainability and international development and space. But I'm not one of those. But I can say, yes, that stuff is being done. Now, whether they're tracking how all the SDGs are being connected together is an interesting question. I actually would like to know as well. But it does seem to be that most people in the space community, if they're working in this field, do see the connections, or at least have some connections between a couple of the different SDGs. Another one is, I think, using, there's smart cities, but also clean energy, and talking about how you can work with clean energy to help create a smart city and vice versa. So there's a lot of different ways that they can connect, but that's typically done through international development, and then they just happen to also have a space component with it, if that makes, in the academic sector anyway. I hope that answers the question. So
Yeah, thanks, Lauren.
I've got one on the side here. So that's in the first one is about how to build a space law administration like the UN USA or ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Union, or the new UN SAT for data and debris. So this is the questions that we grapple with at the international level. Of course, it's hard to find consensus to build a document, let alone find another organization, because states don't want to lose what little control they have at the international level. So I would say if it's a organization that's doing something to support but not manage, then it's likely. But as soon as you start thinking about administration or managing, it gets very touchy for a lot of states that don't want to lose their sovereign rights and their power and their international control. However, I know the Space Data Association and Space Safety Coalition are building up, interaction between private sector, academia, and states, as well as having best practices that are non-binding but can be implemented if they choose to use them. So we've got a couple of things that are popping up that are kind of more, they're international in scope, but they're not powerful, say, but they're able to kind of give their input and support where they can.
We have a hand up for you there. Jim Ridgway had his hand up, Lauren.
Yeah, I was going through the chat, but yeah, go ahead, Jim. Thank you.
It was really just a comment about Stuart's question that the United Nations have got one of the elements on their website talks about these kind of cross impacts between the conflicts between sustainable development goals, because clearly they're not completely aligned. If one gets better, other ones are going to get worse. So it's not a kind of everyone a coconut. So if you think about something like water, okay, so you want clean water for humans, but you also want water for food production. So there's basically inherently in some parts of the world, there's a real tension between the two. So you can find on the United Nations website some of these maps of these cross impacts. So you can click on an SGG and you can see the indicators that are kind of aligned in a positive way, and you can see the indicators that are aligned in a negative way. Okay, so if this goes up, well, it's going to go down unless you're very careful. Okay, that was just an
Thank you. Yeah, the other thing is on the UN Office of Outer Space Aware's website, you can click on each SDG and they kind of give a couple of examples of how space could support them. And there's an organization, EURISI, and I can write it in, and they're based in Paris, and they also look at national case studies. So they have states that come and give information, and you can see how different countries are tackling SDGs with the use of space technology, or space technology plus drone technology, or space technology plus other forms of data collection. And that's actually a really interesting site that can kind of just show you how things are being done. And some of them are a little bit outside the box, which I like. So there are some organizations that are kind of supporting these crossover endeavors and how space can support them too. I didn't see any questions in the chat, but if there are any others, please go ahead. Or if you have ideas, thoughts, this is kind of the open thought about what I've said is really just to say that space can support sustainable development goals and that it is being discussed at the international level. But of course, we'd like to see that trickle down. Of course, it's trickling down to national level, but how is it happening at the local level, and how are end users getting advantages from that? And how can we be more outwardly supportive to let other industries know that we actually have a way to support them with meeting these goals?
We have a great question there from Naya.
Yeah, let me read that one really quick. I mentioned SDG 4, quality education. how does upskilling, reskilling the workforce and producing graduates who are capable of supporting space allocations? Yeah, so I think that's the thing. I think is more, as like I was saying earlier, I've got the colleague who actually studied in international development, but now in her fellowship research, she's actually looking at space. So I think those of us in academia that maybe have an interest in space or have that international development or, you know, sustainability training can start then thinking about it from different perspectives. So it would be good to see more of that. It would be good to see more trained on how to understand the use of space data, but it's not just about understanding that it's there, but then there's also this divide between having the space data and being able to analyze and interpret. I think Den's mentioned the same with his SSA data. It takes a long time to learn how to analyze and use the data that's coming from space. So there's this uphill curve almost that if you want to use the space data, you have to be trained on how to analyze it and use it correctly as well. Maybe Denz, do you have input on that? Because I think that might be our lacking point when it comes to connecting space to sustainability, the knowledge of how to analyze all the data that comes in every day.
I can certainly add more to that, but I noticed both Stuart and Mark have got questions. So I don't know if we want to flick to them and we can come back to discussing the upskilling side of things. Mark, if you want to go first.
Yes, okay. I'm here from Germany and we have geoportals in almost every city where we have all the data collected from various satellites who were implemented, and we had this big floods and we know about it, but we was not able to care about our data. So this was a chain who didn't work. But I also write something about the Space Generation Advisory Council. I have been at the Unispace 3 in 1999 in Vienna, and we built the Space Generation Advisory Council, and now there were 15,000 people who went through this organization, and they're around the world and they are connected, and they wrote 1 year on a program called EAGLE, where they set the space sustainability. And with the International Institute of Space Law, we built a knowledge basement where you can get information every week. And so the space community is connected. But what's the lack is to the normal people. They always think we're doing something out there which doesn't connect to their life, but it's directly. So that's really the point, how to show the people how they are connected. And with the space debris, we need an organization to collect all this stuff and recycle it, because it's really worth material. And with modern 3D print, we could make everything with it. And we need a station which is under an international treaty or something like that, like this administration, where we can do it, like in the open seas or something like that.
That's a really good point you make there, Mark, before I go on to Stuart, because it reminded me of when I was doing my master's. I did a master's in peace and development whilst I was still in the military. So I was actually a senior officer in the Royal Air Force with a master's in peace, which I quite enjoyed having that status. But that's an aside. When interviewing 17 people for my dissertation about perspectives on space security and whether the UK had it. And interestingly, a number of people came back with when I asked about shouldn't people understand more the significance of space to their lives. And the response I got from some very senior people was, well, they don't need to understand that. All they need to know is that the government will maintain it for them. And of course, the significant bit is that the more they understand, the more they want it maintaining. So actually, it's really important that they do understand that significant piece. And Stuart, I've stolen the limelight, so I'll hand straight over to you. You have a question.
Yeah, so I think it sort of relates to Mark's point as well, because he mentioned space debris. And I think if you were to slightly stretch a point, you might say that item 12 on the sustainable goals relating to responsible and sustainable production might, sort of be a mandate for doing a better job of managing the debris in Earth orbit. But one of the issues that, sort of we're facing as a challenge in terms of, sort of balancing things in the way that Jim was talking about just now, is that we definitely would like satellites in order to make a lot of the measurements that we need for climate change and various of the other sustainable goals. You know, we can't monitor what's happening very effectively unless we have access to the satellite data that we use for meteorology, etc. But one of the things that's happening at the moment with the mega constellations is that, you know, some of the astronomy community are starting to complain that, you know, we're clustering up the skies and making their observations difficult. And although some astronomical observations don't sort of contribute to the sustainability of life on this planet, the hunt for potentially threatening near-Earth asteroids certainly does. And, you know, it would be kind of a tragedy if we didn't have access to the satellites and you know, but it would also be a tragedy if we messed up the observations of the astronomers that are helping to, you know, sustain life on the planet in the very widest sense. And one of the things that I wonder a little bit about the set of goals is that it does seem to me to rather treat the Earth as a bit of a closed system, and I can't really see so much evidence of external influences like potential changes on the sun, or indeed you know, a near-Earth asteroid, you know, heading our way, as something that would be, you know, sort of very important to that agenda.
Yeah, I would agree that they're definitely more earthbound, if you will. But I think that's where our industry has the role to kind of help show the connection and also show the importance of, if you think of space as our extended environment, as part of the Earth environment, especially the orbits, that then they should also have some environmental considerations as well. And space debris is, of course, the biggest one. Lauren has her hand up, and then I think we have a break, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll let you take go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to come back on the reskilling question, but right before, if I may, jump back on what was just said about astronomy. So I'm a trainee at ESO right now, so the European Southern Observatory, and we just had this conference that's called the Dark and Quiet Skies. So if anyone is interested to look into that, that looks about, that analyzes the impact of mega constellations on astronomy from different point of views. And it's actually fairly interesting. But about the reskilling question, it's more of a comment that I have, that usually we always talk about how to reach academics or students, but I feel like we often forget people who are outside the education sphere. Like, for example, I wrote a piece on how space can help the blue economy and the sustainability of like the maritime transport, like these sort of activities. And like, there's so many things that satellites can do, especially like Earth observation satellites. But if fishermen, for example, don't know how to implement this in their daily activities, then it's kind of like, we have the technology and we know what it can do, but then it stops there. So I think it's also important to try to reach out to, you know, like, yeah, fishermen, and then farmers, and, you know, people who are outside of education or research.
So on that one, I know that UN USA with partner countries will have international events that talk about specific topics. For example, UN and Austria always have a set conference in the autumn on sustainable development in some form or fashion. But again, it's very high level discussion. And I think that's where having our discussions go out to non-space community, interacting with international development organizations, interacting with local organizations, and like boots on the ground would help make those connections, because that was part of the problem I see. We may know how to use the data and process it, but those that might benefit from it, potentially not, or even know that it exists. For example, a lot of people don't realize that, I believe it's Copernicus satellite data is free and accessible to download and use, but it's a matter of not just downloading it, but understanding how to analyze and use it, which I think is a big point that we have to think. And on the constellation versus astronomy, there is an agenda item now at COPUIS, and I know that the IAU is also behind this discussion. And there's also been discussions between SpaceX and say NASA or SpaceX and the astronomers on these topics. So these kinds of sustainable issues in space are starting to be looked at as well. I want to say, Denzel, keeping me on track. Are we taking a break now, just so everybody can have a little bit of tea or coffee or whatever, and then we come back in, I think like 15 minutes, if I wasn't mistaken?
Yeah, the original plan was 15 minutes. So I'll say let's take a 10-minute break, and then you and I can talk about how we restructure, because we've lost Chris. And then everybody, thank you for your attention so far, and be prepared to engage more from minute 45 onwards. See you soon.
Is it possible to pause the recording, or we have to keep it going? I never remember.
That's a good question. I don't know. Let's have a look. I'm assuming
Leah just said we can pause it. I can't see to do it. You have to. So as long as we can find a way.
Yeah, let me just stop what I was doing now. I was trying to minimize something, and it tells me I can't because I'm recording. There's a pause there. Good afternoon, all. Welcome back from the break. I just stopped sharing because I think that was the only way I could stop or restart the recording. And we're now back to recording, and we're now back to sharing. So as you see from the program, the whole idea was to move on to some breakout rooms for some small individual discussions. However, because of the events that happened before, we thought we'd try it first with the whole group. So there's 22 of us. 20 of you to talk, and Lauren and I to sit and listen is the general idea, but we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, I will just flick through to a slide and then hand over to Lauren again briefly. Probably would have been quicker to actually have gone, or maybe not. So just drop out and reopen on the slide we want. So what we have is a series of questions that we wanted the people to ponder in the workout group. But I think it'd be a great forum for us to discuss these questions as a group. And I will hand over to Lauren to talk through this slide.
So I apologize up front. When I was told to put things together, my focus was space for SDGs. But of course, if you want to also think about how space can be sustainable for satellites to be able to do their job, we can have that discussion too. But essentially, these questions really focus more down to space for sustainable development goals because of the upcoming COP26 that's here in the UK. So the first thing I thought is just basic, but we've kind of discussed this. How can space applications support sustainable development goals from a technical, scientific, perspective? And then, given that I know that the audience is in the space industry, what we can do to support that through our institutions and through our research and through our work. And then on the right-hand side, we've just given you a little bit more of a deep dive to think about, like, how can we make actionable recommendations? Who's going to be able to execute the ideas we come up with, and who would be able to benefit from them? And that's a big missing link here, is that at the end of the day, who are the end users? Who is actually going to benefit from having space supporting sustainable development goals? And I like to also mention, because I'm on the social science side, don't be afraid to think about how we could consider pushing for policy change or norms or standards or best practices that would make it easier or more approachable to use space for sustainable development. And how can we get that word out to other industries? Because personally, I think the media is not doing a great job, except to show us that we have all these really cool rockets and Elon Musk is doing all this stuff. How can we get media engaged to understand this side of things about sustainability in space and supporting sustainable development? And how can we, get the general public? So there's a lot to kind of think about, but it all kind of just thinks about what can we do apart from just say, and then how can we make that happen, and who's going to benefit and who's going to make it happen? That's really what I would like to take away from this section, in my opinion. Dennis, do you have anything else to add about, like what you're expecting?
No, not really. I mean, I suppose one of the key points to me is political. more than anything else. And that is a political opportunity for us as an organization and for the organizations that have joined us today, and for other entities, about getting the message across. Right now, we have a government that's very focused on investing in space. We have a government that is claims to be focused on sustainable future, and they are hosting COP26 next month. So we have an opportunity to press the political buttons to get our message across, I suppose. So a consideration there is the support for space is great, but really the education of how space supports the SDGs and how important it is to fuel that, I think, is a key one to go on.
So I'm kind of thinking if everyone takes a few minutes to just digest and think about what they want, you can raise your hand, you can put in the chat, however you want to do it. But really, we're hoping to get your input. The way the work breakouts would have been is that we would have, round tabled it a bit more. But yeah, just kind of think about how can we all kind of drive this initiative that we want to showcase that space can be part of the SDG and COP26 discussion, really.
As I'm screen sharing, I'm not sure if I can see when people raise their hands or not.
I can keep an eye on that.
That's good.
Well.
I think it's very good to go back and revisit the whole concept that Mark brought up about how we inform people more than anything else. And I'd like to open that up to the floor to see if they have any points on better ways to get the message out. Personally, having worked in space surveillance and tracking on the military side for a couple of decades and understanding the military perspective and the fact that they've spent the past 5 to 6 decades trying to hide data on objects in space. The big question is, how do we bring that out? How do we democratize that more? So I suppose it's a data question more than anything else. And I'd welcome any points on that.
Can I just offer an observation, Dins, which is that completely agree with your point about military data, but it's also the case that some of the data that's held by satellite operators about the status and health of their satellites, and sometimes their positions as well, is commercially sensitive and can affect their share prices. So there are commercial reasons for not sharing SSA data as well as military ones.
I fully concur with you, Stuart. Having I'm trying to remember the name of the book now. Having read the book on the deployment of Iridium back in the day, eccentric orbits, I think it's called, which was really good because it highlighted a point on the early days of the Iridium operations where they were actually getting they were losing stock on the stock market, for want of a better phrase, because amateur satellite spotters were reporting yet another Iridium tumbling and therefore must be failed, and therefore this network isn't working, and it was actually costing them money on the stock market. So yeah, there's a certain amount of information they obviously want to keep, but there's a certain amount of transparency they could also provide as well, which would help maintain their flotation both in space and on the stock market.
Yeah, I think that point is potentially true. Portraying themselves as responsible operators in space is potentially a good thing, and would enhance their reputations. But I was at a satellite observers conference at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh back in the 1990s, and they actually put up the extraordinarily strongly worded letter that they'd had from Iridium's lawyers to say cease and desist. Some companies are quite strident in their view that they don't want their data in a public database.
Interesting. That's a very good point. I suppose the important thing about sharing of information, the sort of angle I'm looking at it to do with sustainability, is more about understanding for people. And so they are able to understand more why space is important to them. And I see Lauren has got a hand up. I'll come to you in a second. One of the thoughts I had recently and I hope I don't offend in any way, is that people, I perceive that many people think that space is out of the reach to them. They think it's for the elite. Certainly the billionaires have propagated that with their launching, and I believe William Shatner might be getting launched today, but with their personal launches. But also on the side of space science, it seemed to be there for those that have the, for want of a better phrase, the education and understanding, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I came through a practical understanding. I nowhere have anywhere near the understanding of physics that any of the people I have the pleasure of working with on a daily basis. I just have an unhealthy interest in satellite operations. But people believe that, well, why should we bother about space? Because it's out of our reach, it's out of touch, it's for the elite, and that's all. And with that note, I'll hand over to Lauren. You had a question.
Thank you. I actually have two comments. So about companies being unwilling to share their data, I think if you make the parallel with like social media industry, it's the same, you know, Facebook and Twitter, they don't want to share the algorithm, but still they have agreements with the research field, so they can still share a lot of data with researchers. So I think something similar could be imagined with, you know, the space industry. And about reaching to people, I agree that sometimes it's frustrating that most people don't know how space impacts them, but in the same time, I feel like, I mean, it's changing, but I feel like the scientific community and also public, you know, the government and whatnot, they don't make that much effort to reach to people. And I mean, if you tell people like generic stories, they don't really care. I think we should be focused on like storytelling and making them understand how it really impacts them in their daily lives. So, I mean, I'm not sure how it can translate concretely, but I think it's like putting it on a more micro level and center it around people and their life, I think is important.
I will say something to that. I've been asked to interview for a couple of news sources on space, and always I've been tagged as the expert on constellations, and I don't know how that happened, but I always try to also swing it back to sustainability and the environment, and that space is doing other things, and that we're supporting sustainable development, and we're supporting socioeconomic and environmental. So it could just be that maybe more of us in the industry need to help sway the argument or put those little nuggets of information in when you're speaking, especially to the media, to make them really understand that, yes, we talk about things about space in space, but we also have direct applications back to Earth. So that's one thing I've been trying to do, is kind of change the way I speak about space to include how we're supporting things back on Earth, if that makes sense.
Yes, I fully agree with that, what you both said. But it's even more. It's not only that the people have to know that it's affect their daily life and their chance for a better job or for a better future at all. But it's also that this time, when we as humanity go back to space, we're going there to stay there. And that is what we need, another form of space infrastructure and architecture. And we need other people to go there. We don't need architects and lawyers and scientific people there. We need people to build something. Yeah, and the people even from the offshore branch, they have a lot of experience in that. And so it's opened up for a lot of more people. So we have to show them their chance to get in this. And this ESA astronaut challenge was that there was about 15,000 people who wants to be an astronaut. So this was really a great dimension. And I think it's so amazing that everybody really wants to do it if he knows about it. And with sustainable developing goals, it's the same, because it's our guarantee to be on Earth for next generations.
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to jump back. I was trying to follow the chat. I think Michael had his hand up next. If you would like to go ahead and go.
Thank you for being patient, Michael.
Okay. Yes, thanks very much. I'm a bit of an imposter here. I'm not in the space industry. I'm a historian of science and technology. I work on the early modern period at the University of Warwick, but I find this whole discussion fascinating. I guess I'm your archetypal end user, since I'm not in the space industry or an astronomer. And this issue of space transparency seems really important to me. It's already been raised. So as an end user or a general member of the public, I guess I'm not interested in knowing exactly what each satellite is being used for. What I'd like to know is what proportion of satellites are being used for A, and what proportion for B, and what proportion for C. If it turns out that 90% of satellites are being used for military purposes, then I might not be that interested in supporting the growth of the space industry. Whereas if it turns out that most of them are used for monitoring ice caps, that might be a different story. Or if lots of them are used for astronomical purposes, for scientific purposes, that's another kettle of fish. So I wonder if that information is available on in aggregate, what proportion of satellites are being used for what. And I guess the more basic point here is that it's not enough just to say some of these satellites are supporting the sustainable development goals. It's important to look at all of them, and also to think about ways that some of them might actually be negatively affecting our ability to achieve those goals. We need to minimize the negative as well as accentuate the positive here.
You make some very good points there, Michael. And actually, it had me thinking a lot then, because when I first sort of like swam into this pool, everybody talked about the fact that there was military space use and civil space use and what they called dual space use. And dual was quite problematic because, particularly in the military mindset, because of course, when you're targeting something, your target has to be proportionate to your aims and all that sort of good stuff. And of course, there are no necessarily any ROEs, rules of engagement in space at the moment. But my personal experience of space operations is that there are only two categories of satellites in space, and that is military and dual use. Because if it has a civil purpose, the military will find a way to utilize that as well. But so it's a very good point, though. But I mean, it is, and it's the problem we have in the SSA world at the moment is the majority of the space surveillance and tracking is done by the military. So we only get a small degree of the data we need from them to be able to understand more about what's happening for sustainable space. Whereas to me, when it comes to sharing data, they want a super highway of information coming into them, but they will release a country lane with passing places of information out to you. But the records are available. I couldn't tell you where, I couldn't put my finger on it, but I can find that information out for you. And certainly Don Palacco at Warwick might have that information as well. But yeah, it's a very good point about ensuring people understand what is the significance, because right now the conversation is all about the military dominance of space. Well, what it should be about is sustainability of, and the amount that commercial space is overtaking, and how significant that commercial space is to supporting sustainable goals on Earth and sustainability of space. I can't access who was next on the calls, but Lauren, I'm sure you've got a hand on that. Thanks, Michael.
I just wanted to add one point there, though, that, for example, one company that's doing a lot for Earth observation is Planet. They used to be called Planet Labs or Planet. They're in California. And so we always painted that the commercial is the evil side, but really there are a lot of organizations that are doing good. And they actually have, because I'm doing research on it, one of the largest satellite constellations in low Earth orbit. So just because SpaceX is seen as the evil one with a mega constellation, there are other, quote, mega constellations up there doing positive. Spire is another one. Spire does a lot of Earth observation. The thing that we have is not all this is data is available, as you know, you're saying, to know what satellites are up there and who's doing what. But there are a lot of commercial entities that are doing it, but of course it then is for a fee and it's not free. So then you have the idea that you're getting some good Earth observation, but you still have to pay for it, which may not be in the best interest of everyone. But I think that led to a question I think Jim was next. 1 second. Valentine had mentioned a question about if the commercial interests are overruling environmental interests. I think it depends on the commercial entity. I would say organizations like I just mentioned, Planet or Spire, or even some of the others have decided that they're going to follow space debris mitigation guidelines. They're interested in thinking about Earth observation for sustainability. They show, I don't want to say it in a greenwashing way, but they do show that they're interested in supporting the sustainability aspect. Is Starlink and SpaceX doing that? Not really, but that's only one company amongst a sea of others that are doing a lot of good. Now, granted, they have more satellites up there and they're doing a lot of different things. However, you have to remember that the state, from an international legal perspective, the state is responsible for all these commercial actors. And I can guess if SpaceX wants to keep their NASA contract with the ISS, they're going to have to at least play a little bit on the regulation side. They wouldn't be able to get licensing if they're not following safety protocols, if they're not following certain things to get those licensed. Now, I know Amazon and OneWeb have been contesting that. You can follow these things online. And maybe that's the thing. Maybe we're finally starting to hold each other accountable for just getting a license and saying that you're being safe and sustainable is one thing, but then holding them to that is starting to show up as well. So I would say that commercial interest isn't really overruling environmental issues. We're just starting to see a struggle about how to work this out legally and politically, essentially. Jim, please.
Okay, this is just another kind of point of information. As Lauren said, this data costs money to collect. And one of the things that the Norwegian Sovereign Fund is being used for is to buy commercial data and put it in the public domain. In particular, they are supporting free access of data to developing countries, in particular Africa. So the idea that nation states can actually push forward the international agenda by working with commercial outfits, by buying data and making it publicly available, is kind of an interesting development, I think.
Agree. I think that's where I mentioned before, not everyone knows that you can use Copernicus data. I think it's one of the only ones that it's actually open, and that's another discussion at the UN, open source. How can we make more data, especially for Earth observation, that's not for military purposes and isn't remote sensing in a way that might conflict between states, but benign data that could be shared in a more open source manner is a discussion that we I've seen come up at the UN. And also on top of it, how do we manage all of this data? A few years ago, they were talking about how do you handle big data in space? There's so much data coming from satellites on a daily basis. How do we even keep track of all of it and utilize it? And then again, at that end, how do the people that need it understand how to analyze and interpret and use the data and the imaging that they're getting? So I think there's a lot on the top down and bottom up, as well as everything in between. And we're just kind of having some growing pains in the industry, in my opinion, to kind of figure out how this is going to look and how we're going to move forward all together. And then I did see someone mention that, yeah, exactly, that's what I was meaning. If SpaceX is getting a license, then perhaps if we're not happy with the way the licensing is going, American citizens should be complaining to FCC and that's where the complaints are being lodged against the FCC in America. You have to remember it's the state that gives the license and the state that's responsible at the international level. So in a sense, if we don't like how a non-state actor, i.e. a commercial actor, is behaving, that could be taken through citizenship. So same thing would happen if we weren't happy with the way OneWeb is being done. I'm assuming then quote me if I'm wrong, you could be writing to your MPs and saying, this needs to change, we want something different. But I know in America, from my perspective, being from America, you can always complain to the FCC or raise objections and just be like, how is this working? Why is this working this way? So it's kind of an open, but I don't know if every country has that ability. Dins, do you want to add about that? Because I think that's interesting that somebody's pointed out we should be also making the licensing procedures or those that are doing the licensing accountable.
I would do if I could find my mouse to be able to point at it. Sharing the screen is a real pain in the but I think it was absolutely right when I saw that comment in the chat about regulations. So the regulators basically, in my perception, follow the political will. They are government officials who have been told to do this job by government, and they have the law in the one hand to follow, and they have the government direction to follow in the other hand. So it becomes quite a conundrum. And the comments about SpaceX and OneWeb and all the others, and I mean the OneWeb one is an interesting one because one could write to one's MP about OneWeb, but of course there's also quite an Indian influence on OneWeb, and UMETSAT now have quite a few shares in OneWeb as well. So there's a European interest in OneWeb as well. So who is going to tell them not to launch? But they're licensing through the UK. So the regulators, I mean, Chris and I have talked about this at length in the past. The regulators do have the power, but do they have the education sometimes to use that power? And do they have the guidance to utilize that power, the free will to do it, because they are obviously doing it as they're told by on the government's will. But it is, we've had this discussion about the space law in the past, and how people say the space law needs to be updated through the space law games that we're running at Northumbria University. We're increasingly finding that actually it's not the space law that's at fault. It's two things. One could say it's the application of, because is there an appetite to apply the law when needed? But the actual second thing is that it's the lack of evidence, because we don't have the capabilities to be able to categorically say that operator has acted in a bad way. We're 60 years into spaceflight, for Christ's sake, and we still are talking about let's sort out the norms of behavior. 60 years? Does it take us 60 years to work out what walking in a straight line is all about? Anyway, you get me going on that one. So I'll leave it and hand back to any other questions on the floor. I think Lauren has something.
Yeah, if I can jump back again on what was just said, I think, so about OneWeb being like involving multiple countries, I think, of course, ultimately it's everything lies in the hand of the country because of state sovereignty. But I think international forums are so like really important, because when you look at the Constellation project from AST Mobile, which is very problematic for the environment, and I think NASA actually filed a complaint against them. But what they did is they just applied for a license in Papua New Guinea, which I'm pretty sure has no regime in place about like environmental impact assessment and things like that. So I think it's also important to have like to look how states can do things, but also provide like an international forum so that like non-space countries or emerging space nations can also understand how to prepare their regime, or like, you know, make sure that they're not used as flags of convenience or things like that.
That's actually happening at the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. So any state that's a member of the UN can become a member of the committee. And one of the things, it's not obligatory, but it's encouraged, is that they then sign and ratify the Outer Space Treaty to at least hold them to some sort of accountability in terms of space. But the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs actually has, I wouldn't say it's a consultancy, but they can help emerging space states build space law. And all of the space law that states wish to share is actually on the UNUSA website under space law. So you can look up the US, the UK, a lot of the regulations are there. Some are in the home language, but there is a bit of knowledge sharing and openness about supporting building a space law regime within a country, as well as sharing it between countries. So there is that happening at COPUOS, but those emerging countries have to want to go to that committee and have to want to become part of the community in order for that to take effect from that perspective. So I think there's something on the side. I'm just looking here in the chat. There's another point about the dark sky and pollution. Yeah, so I think that a lot of it is looking at more on sustainability in space, which is also fine. But are there any other thoughts? I mean, I'm just swinging it back. Like, any other thoughts on how we could really like openly get out to the other industries that space is supporting more than just our own interests? We're looking at socioeconomic situations. We're looking at environmental issues. You know, I know that I think someone mentioned maritime. There's lots of things that space can do to support maritime endeavors. I'm just thinking, like, but again, it goes back to that, how do we inform? How do we get that information out? And I think that's still the question. We're very good at explaining all this to one another. the UN, when they come to committee, they're very good at explaining it to one another, but it's still that getting it out to the people that might need it or benefit from it that seems to be our choke point. And I think that's the difficulty. Another caveat is, especially at the international level, not most non-state actors are not allowed to come to committee, and they're definitely not allowed to vote on anything. It's only states. So you don't have commercial entities in the room unless they're being brought on a state delegation. So even discussions that are happening and things that are moving forward at the UN, it has to be trickled down and brought back to the national level, and it has to be shared with their non-state actors, or they may not even know that it's happening. So that's just another little caveat. I'm always the one with all the I'm always the one with all the negative answers, because I feel like seeing it happen at the UN, you realize that it's very slow, and there's still a lot of things that are done in a very traditional, old, state-only perspective.
What's always maybe doesn't surprise me, but yeah, it does surprise me, is everybody, when they talk about we need an international organization to help support, and I use that that word, space traffic management, to be able to support that, because it is a global requirement in the future. And they go, well, the UN, ideally suited for it. They're ideally suited for some of the big soft power state and slow boiling issues that occur. But when it comes to dynamic operational requirements, unfortunately, an international organization like the UN is not suitable, because you need to be responsive and proactive and responsive, not just debate change. I mean, what they've done for space sustainability with the 25-year, for want of a better phrase, rule, and I know Chris will shudder if he heard me calling it the rule, has been great. But how long did that take? And I know, Lauren, I saw you got your hand up.
Yes.
It's actually, it was Leah and then
Mark. Leah, sorry, my apologies.
So I did put something in the chat, but I think it got missed in all the talk about Starlink. It was just, I was going through the SDG pages from UNOSA, and it strikes me that quite a lot of them are really unidirectional in terms of what space can do for whatever sustainable development goal is being talked about. And I looked kind of quite more deeply at the education one than I did at the other ones, but it's very much focused on kind of what space can do for you. And I feel that is often a problematic framing for communities, particularly for low and middle income countries, because that's the nature of the dialogue. It's not a dialogue; it's a monologue. It's someone saying, I can do this for you. Why won't you take my services? And I think there needs to be some work around framing some of the impacts that can be had, so that the ELMIC communities themselves feel like they're actually having some input. Certainly the way that the web pages are phrased doesn't make it look that way. It doesn't make it look like you can provide an input into the future development of space services. It's very much, here's what we can offer you, take it or leave it. And I think that's quite problematic for the perception of the space industry, of space science, and yeah, just the whole sector. It looks very much dominated by high income countries, and I think the ELMICs are kind of left going, well, do you need us, and what for? So if you're worried about communication, I think that is a point that needs to be addressed.
I actually, I think we had a discussion about the fishermen, or the people that are fishing. Do they know that it exists? Do they know that they can use it? How can they use it? I have a colleague in Hungary who has been working on using space technology to support beekeepers. And the first thing they had to do was go and actually ask them, would you understand how to use this technology? Would it be beneficial to you? And how can we support you? And I think that that's the missing link also. We tend to forget that we need to go out to the end user and ask, do they even want space technology? Do they understand how to use it if they do? And how can we get it to them with limited resources? So you're completely right. That's why I say I find that space is a very high level discussion, and it always drops out and forgets that we haven't asked if they even want to use it or understand how to use it, and then training people on that. And that's, again, where we talk about knowledge sharing and capacity building at the UN, but then I don't know how they're actually doing it in practice in like boots on the ground scenarios or whatever, because not everyone at the UN that's allowed in the room is actually doing a lot of that work. So you're completely right. I think, Mark, you had your hand up. I'm sorry. You can go ahead.
Yes, I think you have to see it on the different levels. There is a level where the people who are on the technical scene or in the space scene, they are doing their things and they are connected with each other and they are doing their knowledge transportation in the on or the other round. Even there is space in Africa, or I told you about the Space Generation Advisory Council. They're doing their things. But the problem is to get it out of their scene, to get the normal people and connect it. And there is this SDG action campaign here at the UN in Bonn, where they had a big festival of impact in the spring, and they still do it. And during the UN General Assembly, there was a SDG action zone for this time, and so they're still keeping it alive. And they're always, even today at this time, in half an hour, there is a meeting called Always Turn It Around, where they try to connect the whole world, and the people just have to be there. And there was a big party in Milan on a special day where the people from around could meet the party, and really there was 3 or 4 hours of a big open air party where everybody can join from around the world, where the people connected, and we have working groups and stuff like that. So it's a SDG action campaign -org. So try it.
I definitely think that's where we're lacking in space. I've noticed from spending, so I've been in 4 different countries and talking about space, and it's always space people talking about space to other space people. So it's definitely thinking about how do we include others in the discussion, because I just had a workshop with students that had nothing to do with space. They were law, they were international policy and things like this. They had really great ideas. And I think we all have the same ideas, no matter if we're in the industry or not. It's just getting that connection and then moving from ideas to actionable moments and tangible things. Because again, we talk a lot about, we should do this, but then there's not a lot actually being done from these high level discussions. Dins, I don't know if you are still with us. I can't see you up here, but I was thinking, I think there's 10 minutes left if you want to kind of keep the discussion going and then wrap up this section.
You're absolutely right. I was just out there checking the slide of the timetable, because of course, whilst I've got the screen sharing, I can't look at what the other slides entail. It's been some very interesting discussions, and I've actually been very impressed with the direction it's going, because I think some of that direction is going to lean very much into what Fiona will be talking about later on, which I thought would be a different lens that should be using to maybe many of the participants. But we've actually asked those questions, and I like some of those comments about the fact that I think to sum it up was something either Michael or Mark stated in the chat about if you don't have a seat at the table, you might be on the meal, so to speak, or on the menu type thing. And it is very important that, to consider the fact that we talk about this sustainability development goals or sustainment development goals and how space supports them. And actually, I'm surprised that maybe some of the Global North haven't discussed about the fact that they can, it's part of their aid to the world by providing these space capabilities to support the development goals and to support the less able actors. Because it's all well and good actually people discussing what we can do to ensure the longevity of space and to be sure that space supports what we do on Earth. But actually, it's still quite hard to get into space, isn't it? There's 7, 8 launch nations, if I remember off the top of my head. very, very quickly, and they only have a certain amount of access. And one thing that I have not seen addressed, here's food for thought before everybody goes off to get a quick comfort break. I've not seen addressed the fact of climate change affecting space launch. Because at the end of the day, a lot of our launch facilities are relatively close to the equator, or in tropical areas that suffer greatly, coastal areas as well, that suffer greatly from the effects of climate change. And so therefore, if we don't do something about climate change, we could actually affect our ability to utilize space as well. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
I was even going to say the other way around. There are a lot of people that may think, why are we wasting taxpayer dollars going to space and launching when we could be using that money for other issues that directly support sustainable development, without using space.
I do get that from a lot of people, because space isn't cheap either, is it? Michael, you got your hand up.
Yeah, this might be a wee bit rambly, but I've just been in New Zealand. I was there over summer, and there's lots of debates about places like Mahia Peninsula and other very isolated, fragile environments which are being scoped out as launch sites. Rocket Lab is the company which is launching a lot of them. And it's very interesting to follow the discussion, because on the one hand, the local Maori community, the indigenous people of New Zealand, are often hostile to these sites because they're seen as a way of degrading the environment. On the other hand, Maori culture has for a very long time, well, forever basically, had a really close relationship with the stars, because you need the stars to navigate. So on the one hand, space is remote and elite and Western. On the other hand, it has been part of many cultures for many centuries or millennia. So we need to think about ways to square that circle.
Absolutely, and you're spot on there, and it is that the point that they're moving away from some of the more traditional sites and commercial space. Space 2.0 has chipped out some new commercial launch areas. I don't see as many people disagreeing with Boca Chica being scoped out by Elon Musk, but then again, it's probably quite a desolate part of Texas, and it's probably bringing in a lot of employment and a lot of interest on that area. But in the UK, one of the first things that the spaceport study generated amongst those in the what I lovingly called the Scottish space race was environmental studies about the effect of these potential launch sites either on the north coast of Scotland or the Western Isles or up in Shetland. Lauren, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just to jump back on the effect on launch site. I don't remember if it's a private or a public project, but China, and I think also SpaceX, are actually developing a maritime platform for launch. I'm not sure what kind of rockets in terms of mass could be launched from those, but I think that's probably something we are going to see more in the future if, as you say, the launch sites are threatened by sea level rise.
It was actually, there was a company in it, the name eludes me, that specialized in sea launch for a number of years. And it was a commercial venture out of, I think it was docked in Los Angeles for quite a while. And it was
sea launch.
That was it. Thank you. Yeah. And I believe it was bought out by a Russian consortium at some point and then moved across, but I haven't heard much about it for a year or two now. I know there was big plans to regenerate sea launch from these guys, but then it all went very, very quiet. And Russia, interestingly, has hardly been spoken about in this discussion. And of course, I've just read recently they're actually investing less in their space ventures in the near future, even though certainly China potentially taking over running ahead of them on that global space race. But of course, they built only just recently built a new launch site, which has only been commissioned 3-4 years at the most, and there hasn't been that much activity from that. And of course, there's all the environmental effects around it. And the environmental side of launch is something that's being seriously watched by some of the developing UK space launch providers. For example, Skyrora, I know, promote their greener fuel that they utilize. They're reclaiming plastic to it's well beyond my understanding of science, reclaiming plastic to turn into biofuel, so fuel of some kind to utilize in their small rocket engines, etc. Of course, I've not seen anything, but I'm sure there's been plenty of studies. But of course, you've also got the consideration of the smaller launch vehicles like Rocket Lab and the ones that are being developed to Skyrora and Orbx in the UK to launch from the UK versus the I'll stick with the Falcon rocket and the was it Falcon Heavy or whatever. But Starship is going to have some phenomenal amounts of rockets. I mean, what environmental impact of one of those launches? And to drop a final thought into your minds before we actually do have a coffee/comfort break, re-entry. There have been some recent studies of the polluting effects of re-entering satellites. And what residue they leave in the atmosphere as they burn up, and it's something to consider when it comes to the greener side of of saving the planet. But of course, something to consider on the greener side of putting objects into space and how we remove them a lot cleaner as well. And I'll leave you with those thoughts before we have a 15-minute break. And I welcome you all back at 4:45 UK time, so in 15 minutes.
3:45.
3:45, sorry. Getting carried away there.
I think we can pause the recording again.
One of the things that kind of we wanted to do was replicate as close as we can to an in-person event. And of course, this is exactly what happens at in-person events, isn't it? People group together and they have a chat and it all sort of spills out. Valentin, I see, is that a legacy hand or is that an actual, a current hand?
Yes, a comment to the SSR, to this Space Sustainability Rate from MIT and from the World Economic Forum. They are on a good path on one side. On the other side, the rating, what they are doing now is they have a kind of, first of all, they do have a rating before launch. That's their focus for the moment. So do not launch if the rating is not good on one side. On the other side, they have a complete lack of the existing environment. So what is up there already, and what is also missing is the dynamic. So they are rating on a mass per square kilometer, and they do ignore the dynamics between the pieces itself. So they are on some way, but they have a big lack on the so-called traffic monitoring. So there is up in outer space, it's called a traffic, so a dynamic between objects. And the dynamic itself is a matter of, like in the road, it's a matter of where do they meet each other. And so I just say they are in a good way, but they did not understand that a static measurement of, or a rating of parts in orbit, that doesn't help to assess the risk. Okay, that was my 5 cents. Thank you very much.
That is really useful. Thank you very much indeed, because I think, again, Valentin, what you're saying feeds very much into a number of discussions that I've seen had in this area and surrounding this area about, this will sort the problem out, or that will sort the problem out. And as I say, I don't know what the consensus is, but I think there's no one solution here. I think a space sustainability rating will work if it gets traction, and if it's, I think as well, one of the things I think about such a metric is it needs to be really, really simple, so that people who are making policy, people who are electing people who make policy, people who are, who are not technical and not technically aware. I'm not technically aware about, refrigeration, but I know that if I go into a shop and I get a fridge that's aerated, it's going to be more efficient, it's going to be more useful, and it's going to be, it's better than a fridge that's C-rated. So no technical knowledge, but I can see that nice sort of that visual thing. And I think this is where we in the space community need to advocate. We need to be talking to our elected representatives. We need to be talking to the policymakers. We can't let this just become the domain of think tanks. We can't let this just become the domain of industry. We need advocacy outside of that. And so I'm sure this has all been said, by the way, I should say. I apologize if I'm going over old ground here, but I think this is something that I think we should be doing ourselves to our elected representatives. Lauren, I don't know if that's going too far or if that's too much of a rant.
Oh, before you stop your rant, actually, there, Chris, I wanted to bring up a great point there from Valentin and probably expand on it a little bit. He spoke about the ratings of parts we put into space and how that helped with sustainability. I mean, you and I have been part of the rumblings of a potential project which the engineers always say, no, it can't be done. And that is the Prospero, finding Prospero idea, the idea of actually retrieving the UK's only UK launched rocket, I should say the UK rocket and satellite launched, because it came from Australia in the end anyway, but object that's still on orbit, and Skyrora have a wonderful ambition to try and retrieve it and then to be able to place it into the British Museum. Now, of course, that generated so many interesting discussions on social media, which were wonderful to follow, from the space the archaeologists, the ones that want a museum on orbit, and how dare we remove a museum piece from orbit. But the most interesting point I heard was from a material scientist who said, wouldn't it be fantastic to be able to dissect an object that's been on orbit for 50 years to actually get an understanding of how the environment has affected those metals on orbit in that time?
Yeah, and I think I'm fully engaged with the heritage people who are talking about, we need to be very careful before we go reaching into space and plucking things out. This is, we could be we're in the realm of unforeseen results. And I have a great deal of sympathy with it. And I think that's one of the great strengths of what Skyrora are looking to do. They are looking to reach out and they're looking to explore these dynamics, because once, as we know, with the space environment, once we put something up there, it's up there, and once we pull something down from there, it's pulled down from there. So we very much have I think we very much need broad buy-in on this, and that's fantastic about the material science. Stuart, please jump in, sir. You wrote about this for the Spaceflight magazine.
Yeah, I think all Dinsy's points were well made. There is definitely scientific merit in making the analyses that he was talking about. The wider agenda in this regard, in terms of heritage in space, extends to the artifacts on the moon, and there is the organization that is seeking to protect the Apollo hardware and other bits of kit on the moon's surface from trophy hunters in the future, who might think it would be cool to have a piece of the Eagle lunar lander or something. So I think there's quite a broad range of sort of discussion here. I mean, one of the points that I made in my article, which I'm not sure if it's been made by the folks that are interested in preserving the moon, is it's not just the hardware, it's actually even the tracks of the rovers. The tracks of the rovers potentially would show evidence, because we know when they were made, would show evidence of the micrometeorite infall rate, which is actually quite hard to measure in other ways. So you could actually go back and do analysis of the tracks and find out something that's scientifically useful. So it's a pretty broad subject.
Stuart, as always, I really enjoy hearing your wisdom on this. You always give me something else to think about, and that's why, honestly, genuine pleasure to speak to you virtually again. And I think that's right. I think there is a number of issues that need to be gone into. There's a number of discussions that we need to think about. And Lauren has raised the excellent point is, you know, do we need to think about future SDGs for the moon? Do we need to think about SDGs for Mars? Linked into that, Lauren has said that, you know, planetary protection requirements, what are they going to look like in the future?
We don't need to worry about them if we don't sort out the space debris apocalypse.
Well, it's really interesting. I think I was thinking about this. I spoke to COSPAR about in January about the dangers of interfering with the planetary protection requirements and how that ties into the discovery of life and false positives, etc., and what we can do in law or in regulation and in guidance to try and help shape those. And I think again, what we're seeing here is that everything is linked to everything else. We started a conversation about sustainable development goals on Earth, and we're already thinking about artifacts on the moon. We're thinking about human colonies on Mars. We're thinking about, you know, how do we make that sustainable? This is showing that this is a link. This is one of the things that I think is a strength of the SDGs, actually, is they provide this common language. They provide this common platform for discussion where we can start conceptualizing ideas of sustainability. And we haven't, you know, there's much of the SDGs that are not applicable to outer space activity. And, you know, there's some we can shoehorn a bit of space in, and there's some that we can say, oh yeah, a space application might help. But there's, you know, the majority of them are regarding our condition here on Earth at the moment. But we don't know how technology is going to develop. We don't know how we're going to develop as an interplanetary species. And if I may, Dins, if I can do a little plug for my own work, I've written about the ethics of space exploration, and with a legal twist. I don't represent myself as an ethicist. I am a lawyer who has training in ethics, and you know. So I'm very much approaching law ethics from the legal utility point of view. We're going to hear from Dr. Fiona Thompson, who is very much an ethicist who will be give you a much greater and a much more valuable analysis than I ever could. But one of the problems I think we have as a spacefaring species, and again, please, Dins, cut me off. Anybody cut me off if you think I'm going on a bit of a tangent here. But I don't think as a spacefaring species, we have an underpinning value. Why are we going into space? Ask 15 people why we're going into space, and I wonder what 15 answers we get. We might get protection of the species, protection from an extinction event. We might get because we're explorers. We might get for economic reasons. There's no single unifying reason. Now, it doesn't have to be. But generally, if I'm building a constitution and if I'm building a regulatory framework, I want to get down to some irreducible values that we have. And I think at the minute, we don't have those irreducible values. So for me, the SDGs provide that platform that we can build on. Now, Fiona's going to tear this apart and tell me where I've gone wrong from an ethicist's point of view, and I hope she does. But that's just from a legal, constitutional, from a regulatory point of view. If I'm looking to build these regulatory frameworks, I'm looking for shared values that we can coalesce around, behaviors that we're looking to prohibit, behaviors that we're looking to incentivize, and looking to see how we can identify these real common principles. And this is where I'm going to go back to it. You know what's coming if you've heard me speak before. This is where the Outer Space Treaty really helps, because that represents a set of principles that the world can agree on. So, Dins, I know I've kind of talked. We've got a couple of hands. Mark.
Yes, I don't agree what you say, because we have hundreds of international organizations which work, and they work on a daily life. They do a lot of good things for people on Earth, and they don't know about it. But most of them are international governmental organizations, and they do their things. And so we might not go to the highest step, just begin with the little ones at the local level and smart cities who connect the data to the SDGs we were needed. But on the other hand, we have this common goal, which is meta law, which is the end of the space law, where we can met other societies which are not humans, and they don't apply for international law like we do. And law is just a tool, and it's a tool for us. And we didn't even know if other ones didn't accept something like law for regulation, or just take violence, or just intelligence, or whatever. So we have to be very careful with this. And meta law has a lot of rules. I read the 12 rules, I think it's about, from Fazan, and there are a lot of things when you think about jurisdiction and control of space objects of states. You have to think about this too, because this regulates how humans and other species should act with another. And we could take this for the SDGs and our living on Mars or Earth or Moon or wherever. So we can handle this over how to treat animals and how to treat plants. And so we have to check out this. And we have a lot of international treaties and international law, common law and whatever. So I don't see there is no base, there is a lot of base, and the SDGs are soft law. So they're a common base they agreed on. Maybe we see some court cases later on about space or about climate change we had in Germany. And so there is a way, and this way still goes on. So.
That is a very optimistic viewpoint, and I am glad you made it, Mark. Thank you very much, because as I say, sometimes my cynicism about the lawmaking process can creep through, and it's very good to have a counterbalance there to that. So thank you very much indeed. I see that, Valentin, we have an answer.
Sorry, that was wrong stuff.
A legacy hand, I understand.
I forgot to lower my.
I understand, my friend. Thank you very much indeed. So Dins, again, I'm sorry I'm hijacking things, because I missed the start of it, and there are so many interesting people with so many great things to say. This is absolutely wonderful. We're thinking now about how to some actions for us to take forward and some things that we're looking to do. And I suppose now probably is the time to discuss something that we've talked about in a number of forums, isn't it?
It is. But before you get too carried away, Elaine's managed to rejoin us, but she's only got 30 minutes to stay with us.
Oh.
So I thought we might, and I've been chatting to her in the chat, we might be able to draw her in first.
That would be lovely.
And because I knew exactly where you were going then, mate. And then Elaine can talk about the Northeast aspirations on space, and then we can meander our way into Nessie.
That is perfect.
If I can say that.
Absolutely fantastic. We'll hand over to Elaine, and you're going to hear some wonderful things about what we're doing in the Northeast, and then we'll show you some of our ideas. Absolutely fantastic. Elaine.
I'll unmute myself. Chris, I stopped you on your flow there.
Not at all, mate. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you, and delighted to be here as well. I've prepared a very short presentation, so I think it's better to do that, and then maybe encourage discussions afterwards. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Elaine Scott. I'm the Centre Manager for the Northeast Satellite Applications Centre of Excellence. Can everyone see the slide?
Yep, they're coming through fine. Thank you, Elaine.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, just to give you a bit of background, we as a centre, we have been operating since 2014, so about 7.5 2.5 years now. I'm technically employed by Business Durham, which is the economic development organisation for Durham County Council. We are funded by the UK Space Agency and the Satellite Applications Catapult. And one of the reasons why we as an economic development organisation, were very keen to get involved was the fact that we own and run this thing that you can see in a picture here. This is Net Park, which is the region's first science park in the Northeast. It's now, I think about 17 years old now. It's in Sedgefield, which is roughly about 15 minutes drive from Durham City. And, just the fact that, space is so multidisciplinary, I think that's the beauty of it. I think you've that's been the theme in the bits of discussion that I've managed to listen to this afternoon. It involves a whole variety of disciplines and domains and people, and consequently, it really helps to connect the different strands that we have on the park, and also actually further afield. So as a centre, we have all 5 universities in the region, part of our consortium and our advisory board. So as you can see there, they include Durham, Newcastle, Sunderland, Northumbria, and Teesside. They all have different capabilities and expertise and different focus. Maybe some areas of slight overlaps, but in the main, that there are lots of complementary capabilities and knowledge and expertise. What I thought I'll show you here as well is just a really general impression of the types of companies that we have in the Northeast. Dins, do you recognize a particular logo on the slide there?
Absolutely. I do like Intelligence Fusion. They're good friends of ours.
Yes. So, in terms of geography, we cover all of the Northeast from Northumberland. This is where I'm testing perhaps everyone's geography here, knowledge. So from Northumberland right down to Tees Valley. So that's really on the borders of Scotland, the Northwest and Yorkshire, just to give you an idea. As you can see on the map there, it's just really a print of, various types of companies and universities in terms of companies that are users of space or in space or creating things for space. So it's quite an interesting landscape. And also on the slides, I'm happy to share these slides afterwards, but on the title of the slide, I've also linked it to our website, which has a directory of space businesses in Northeast. So if you're interested, feel free to dive into that at your leisure. I'll just quickly skim through this. I'll head straight to the future is probably where you're interested in. But just to give you an idea of the Northeast, those who are familiar, there is a biannual report, the Science and Health Space report. The most recent one has shown that, the Northeast is doing pretty well, considering we had so little of space to speak of, 7 years ago. So we're not Harwell, we're not Southeast in terms of income and numbers of employed, but we're really delighted to show that we're on a trajectory. If you look at what's in the brackets at the bottom in terms of growth in income, growth in employment, growth in the number of space organizations in Northeast. So we're really excited by that trend. And then regional capability, I've just put in there some of the key areas that capabilities what we have in the region. And as I've mentioned before, space is one of those wonderful things. It's multidisciplinary. I don't need to tell you that. You all probably know that already. But in terms of location, we have, I think 2 very strong assets. Well, more than 2, but if I can group them into 2 key areas, one is the fact that we're just on the North Sea is just on our doorstep. So if you're thinking about maritime, offshore, well, in fact, the world's largest offshore wind farm is on our doorstep at Dogger Bank. So you're thinking about applications and the use of satellite applications, that's the right area to try test technologies and applications. The second key geographical asset is the fact that we're close to Scotland, Yorkshire, and the Northwest. As we know, there's a lot happening in Scotland and increasingly in Yorkshire and Northwest, where they have strong capabilities around digital and manufacturing. So, we feel that as a geography, that's a really untapped sort of collaboration that we can, go into going forward for the future. So what next? I've just stuck in there. So we're based at Net Park, and this is where you would have been today.
Yeah, sorry about that, Elaine, my fault.
No, I mean, things happen, don't they? But so this is a new space enterprise lab. We were officially launched last week, the first of 11, but there were 5 that were launched last week in the UK. And you would have been the first, official event that we've hosted, but never mind. There's always the next time. So, I'm inviting, you all to come, and this is a physical space to run, it's for the space community. So, you'll be running events or meetings, and we're hoping to open this up a couple of days a week for the space community to hot desk. So I'll just leave you at that. If you're interested, please do get in touch. But in terms of the space sector in the Northeast, so I mentioned we have been running the centre for about 7 years now, and we're looking at scaling up the sector. We commissioned a feasibility study. Well, we did commission, a couple of organisations did. The Catapult and the UK Space Agency commissioned feasibility studies Q1 this year and Q1 last year. The upshot of that has been the development of an outline business case for a Northeast Space Hub, and DISC, which stands for Disruptive Innovation for Space Capabilities. And this, if we're successful with the funding, would be located at what we call Phase 3A at Net Park. So I mentioned that the science park, it's 17 years old now, and just last month, the Durham County Council approved financing of £50 million to develop Phase 3A to really accommodate, some of the companies that are really growing quite quickly and that are currently on the science park, which is nice to see. But also, I would really like to, this to be the nerve center for space in the Northeast, but also, servicing the rest of the region, but actually having some key facilities here. So that's an architect's drawing of the Northeast Space Hub. So it'd be a gateway building to engage with the sector, pretty much something quite similar to what's available in Harwell, some of you who know it well. But also, having some prototyping and testing facilities for businesses and the community. The disruptive innovation for this is very much more about hardware, really, and also looking at some capabilities around networks and enabling businesses to try out new technology. So for one example is a future network. So that's really about SATCOMs and terrestrial communications. So if you're developing devices for, IoT and so on, that needs to be tested against different types of communication networks, that would be the place that you would come to tap into the expertise and also, the facilities. And what we have also included in our first phase of the business case is a living lab for health and well-being. So, that's certainly one of the SDGs that's been talked about. So, in the Northeast, we've been doing quite a bit of work with the Economic Health and Science Network and the NHS. So telehealth and telemedicine, for example, is a key focus area, and virtual reality for surgery, for example. So, and also the other one that's more recent is the use of urban air mobility to deliver blood samples and so on and so forth. So and that's really against a very rural landscape. So, you know, this is a really exciting opportunity for us to take some of these ideas forward, and also cyber testing, which is all inherent within that. So hopefully that gives you a sort of broad brush view of what we've proposed in the outline business case. I'll stop at that. One of the things that we've discussed is with this particular group, I'll just stop sharing, is you know, the idea of setting up a special interest group for space sustainability. I think it's very much you know, early stages. We have set up special interest groups for satellite communications, one for industry, another one for academia. But you know, really, we hope that the special interest group around space sustainability will start to coalesce, you know, the different interests that we have in the region to take some of the ideas and discussions forward. I'll stop at that. Maybe Dins, you want to add to what I've just said?
Elaine, that's an absolute wonderful segue, because we threw on the program to discuss NESI, and everybody's probably looked at the timetable, the schedule, and said, what is NESSI? And it is a very tongue-in-cheek added to the program, but it's a very important piece. And the Northeast Sustainable Space Institute, which one day will become the UK, or UKIS, the UK Institute for Sustainable Space, and become a pan-global, whatever, pan-planet organization, maybe eventually, who knows. But it's, you know, I think you made the point very well in talking about space in the Northeast by talking about the variety of commercial entities that are involved in utilizing benefits from space, or trying to get activities into space, or working around space. And one of the things that's always drawn me to space, and because I'm not a scientist, as everybody knows that, in fact they do often they can't find the pigeonhole to put me in, but it's a case of space is inclusive. It's not an exclusive venture. You might need billions to be able to launch into space. You might need to have a huge brain to really understand what's going on about it, but it's all around us. I mean, living in Northumberland, I get to see the beauty of the sky at least 20% of the time, when the clouds have parted, and you know, it never seems to wonder me. The wonder of it never seems to amaze me. And so space sustainability is an inclusive piece. And you know, building on some of the discussions of this afternoon, people talked about getting the message out to the right people, and people maybe not feeling part of this wonderful area. And that's the whole idea of the space sustainability working group for the Northeast initially, that one day Chris and I will have aspirations for it to grow into you know, a bricks and mortar institute to support the entire community, from academia, whether that's physics or maths or whatever, through to the social sciences. We're supporting the banking, supporting well, in the future, if people have their ways, because I cringe when they talk about automated cars, because I know about the fragility of GPS, but whatever should happen from the benefits of space in the future, to have that focal point for the Northeast, to bring in the interest, to help instill the skills and experience, and then to drive forward the investment in the Northeast is something that NESI, or whatever it's going to be called, is sort of planned to be in Chris in my mind. And I will put that before anybody starts thumping the table and saying, we haven't heard about this Northeast Institute, why aren't we part of it? Because it's a kernel, because it's an idea that's beginning to grow. And I won't waffle anymore, and I'll let Chris add to his nods with a few more words as well.
Thanks, Dins. And it's always the same. It's like following Coldplay at Glastonbury following you. It's almost impossible. But yeah, the plan is very embryonic at the minute. We have no real sort of definition or shape to it beyond an idea that we think that the Northeast could become this hub for coalescing around space sustainability. We're a region that has or that is in the process of regenerating after the Industrial Revolution, after having mining and steelworking and shipbuilding as part of our heritage. It's now firmly in the past, and we are having to regenerate, we are having to move on. And so I think that gives us a unique perspective on the way in which space exploration and human space activity is heading. We think that there is a need for such an institute to speak to a number of stakeholders. We're looking to talk with industry. We're looking to work with academia. We're looking to bring in, you know, no matter how offbeat, no matter how off beam an idea it might be, we're interested in bringing it in and having it as part of the discussion, having it as part of the formation of the Northeast Space Sustainability Institute. As Din said, there may be people out there thinking, I should be knowing about this. Great, you know now, come to us, let's get involved and let's work together. We are, you know, we're not the founders, we're not the if anything, we're the sort of the TomTom or the route map or the instruction manual. We're trying to find a way to build a consensus on this, because as I said, and those of you that were listening in the break will have heard me say this, space traditionally, I feel, belongs to them. It belongs to the people launching the rockets. It belongs to the companies. It now appears to belong to billionaires. And space should belong to us. It should belong to everybody. Everybody should feel involved in space. And the way we do that is by advocating space sustainability to everybody, not just to a closed community, but to policymakers, to people, you know, in the street, people who don't understand the way that the food chain and the food supply chain depends on space activity, that don't really appreciate just how ingrained within everyday life space actually is. That sounds patronizing, I know, but I also know that we really just need to get the message out there. The Northeast Space Sustainability Institute is looking to provide academic, industrial, practitioner, governmental, regional input into the sustainability debate to anyone who'll listen. And that's our plan. So if you're listening to this and if you think that you have something to give, if you'd like to, you know, just have a 5-minute conversation with a mad space professor or with a director of a space company, whatever it is, whatever involvement you would like, we're reaching out and we say, you know, come to us and we'll have a discussion with you. It may be that, you know, it's only a brief mention. It may be that we incorporate it thoroughly. We don't yet know what it's going to look like. Lauren, I see your hand.
Yeah, you mentioned billionaires and with the recent travel to space and space tourism, and people are like, yeah, but it's just about billionaires. I think what should be explained to people is also the importance of like trailblazing, because I mean, if you think of GPS, like GNSS technology, I don't think a lot of people realize it's coming from like a military space technology that was in the beginning absolutely inaccessible to anyone but the military. And because we kept advancing the technology and it became cheaper and smaller, then it is accessible to people. So I think they only see space tourism as accessible now to billionaires, but we also have to explain the process and how it's necessary to pass by this. And billionaires funding all of these projects because governments don't have enough money. So yeah.
I think that's a firm agree from me. I absolutely agree with you. This device here, right? You can't see it because I've got my background on, but my mobile phone. I bought my first mobile phone in 1996 and it was the size of a small brick. It gave me like 5 minutes of battery life and the monthly bill was astronomical. And because of the ubiquity, because of the way in which it developed, because market pushed it in that direction, we can now, you know, we think nothing of having a mobile phone with us. We think nothing of making a phone call on it. We think nothing of surfing the internet on it. I absolutely agree with you, Lauren. I think this is a real advocacy job to do. I think telling stories like that is exactly the way to bring people in. Thank you very much indeed. I see Elaine's hand is raised.
Well, Chris, you must have been reading my mind because one of the things I was just going to say was, you know, I've heard it several times. You know, people have used the example of the iPhone the technology. Apple didn't create all the individual technologies that are in an iPhone. They assembled it, they designed it, but all the really clever stuff was, you know, as Lauren said, you know, the GPS was, you know, created by defense and so on. I think that really brings it home for a lot because people know what an iPhone is. So I guess there's also another story to be told about, you know, the digital infrastructure of the future, because most people think, oh, well, it's the thing that's under the ground, you know, the fiber that, you know, provides. And while satellite communications have been around for donkey's years, but it costs you how much? But if you're on a cruise ship, or any ships that you can think of. It's really about opening up their minds, I suppose, and getting them to imagine a future where, you know, the rest of the population in the world that hasn't got access to fiber, you know, how could they be connected? And how does that then open up their world in terms of education and health and, you know, and I guess those kind of, again, hits all those SDG goals.
Absolutely agree with you, Elaine. And I think there's a real balance to be struck here, isn't there? Because people, and you know, I speak from myself, I speak from research that I've seen done. People like stories. The stories make things come alive. But if we're not careful, we get trapped in nostalgia. You only have to, you know, listen to certain parliamentary debates about space activity, and they will all start with how wonderful Apollo was and how they all. And that doesn't cut any ice. You're right. We need to show the linked nature, and this again goes kind of back to a point I made before, that everything is connected in this. Everything is connected to everything else. The SDGs don't sit in isolation from our desire to clean up the space environment. They don't sit in isolation from our desire for smart cities. They don't sit in isolation from our desire to make quality of life better. It's all part of the same nexus. And I'm hoping that with the Space Sustainability Institute and with, you know, bringing disciplines together, bringing mission planners, bringing satellite constructors, bringing, you know, coders, big data people, yes, policy people like myself and lawyers, bringing all of them together to create a real soup of space innovation, but located around sustainability. I think that's the way we engage, and that's the way we change the narrative from look at them doing that to, hey, what are we all doing?
I'd like to actually reach back a little bit as well on the I can't say the word now, inclusion of everyone in space, because you reminded me of the fact we have some space artists in the Northeast as well. The beauty of having the Sustainability Institute is to include everybody and anybody and to make sure, and that's the only way we can get the message of space and the significance and benefits of space out to all. You know, by the small voices getting bigger and the ripple effect, I suppose, more than anything else. Is that classed as gravitational? I don't know. Sorry. You have to excuse me punning away because it's been a long day. Elaine, thank you very much for your presentation on the Northeast. I was just about to say something there that sounded like I was leaving, but I'm not. It's been a pleasure being part of the Northeast journey, and I know that we're going to be part of that journey for a long time yet. And looking forward to the way forward. It's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, scooting back to the program because we've pleaded, talked, discussed, pontificated about our thoughts on NESI, and it's for those in the Northeast, it's an all holds open door to all to come and talk to us and we can get it going. The key bit is getting it started. We had some discussions earlier in the year, but there were too many people in the room. I think the way Chris and I will plan to start this is through a small group of interested academics. We know the right point of contact to help bring the academic streams together in the Northeast, and from that we will then move it forward so it's a broader and wider organization, and it will dovetail into GNOSIS and hopefully help generate and promote GNOSIS as well, and then dovetail into what the UK government wants. But more importantly, it'll bring the skills into the Northeast, into a beautiful and affordable part of the country that we all love and enjoy, and help and benefit others for the future, most importantly. But what I'd like to do for the next 15 minutes before we hand over to Stuart to talk about some of the GNOSIS challenges is actually to do a recap on some of the significant points we've had today. And I wondered if anybody might have anything they wanted to bring up before I started talking. So from that stunned silence, I think I'll first talk about the fact that one of the key bits brought up during our discussions is that piece of education, both outside of the space sector for educating people. I suppose we could probably wrap it up as education and understanding. Education maybe in the terms of the Sustainability Development Goals, in that we support utilizing space to support remote education, utilizing space and space sciences to support local education, and to generate the education and skills to support the future, not only of the space sector, but more importantly, the future of the global sector. Maybe leaning back into some sustainability piece, the fact that Chris and I have worked closely with Harriet Brettle at times from Astroscale, who is now in the space sector, but who has began her career in the banking sector, if I remember rightly. So, this shows you don't have to be a space scientist to work in space. And in fact, I think the fact that space is all around us actually helps generate that. You have to stop me before I get into the old space dust pontifications and thoughts and whatever else. But the fact that you don't have to be a space scientist to get into the space sector. We had a trainee lawyer working for us as an administrator for a short while in our company. We were blessed for Jodie to come and join us before she went back on her law career path. But we benefited from her experience, and she learned a bit about space. We have somebody joining us in our company fairly soon who has, I've forgotten her master's now, but it's she's got a degree in history, but a significant her master's was phenomenal. But anyway, again, no link to space, but I guarantee you she's going to be as space geeky as the rest of us after a few weeks in our office at Norse. So one of the key pieces I think we pulled up during the early discussions was the need for developing education and understanding, triggering more education and understanding that way. Another bit we looked at and discussed that in the rounds was the transparency of data. Was one of the specific things we mentioned, but again, I would like to talk there on the transparency of the space sector in general. Tipping my hat if I was wearing one to Stuart on the grounds of commercial sensitive stuff has to remain commercial sensitive. Military sensitive stuff has to remain sensitive. Yes, there's got to be certain caveats. However, right now there's a carte blanche caveat that you don't get any of this information because it's provided by the military. Yeah, I can step outside my back door of a night and watch satellites overfly on a regular basis. I am that geek that does regular International Space Station spotting. And in fact, I can say I've spotted it from the officers' mess at RAF High Wycombe. I've spotted it from a hill at Saxe-Ford. And recently, last Friday, so was it last Friday? 2 weeks ago, sorry, a week last Friday, I was sitting having dinner at home and I looked up over my wife's left shoulder and I spotted the International Space Station. I spotted it from my dining room. Space is there for us to see. So why is there so little transparency of these objects on orbit? And we obviously need to educate the public again. So linking back to that education on space as well, and making it more transparent as such. And then of course there's accessibility to space as well, and how much that can be utilized to support the development goals. Of course, the space accessibility piece is very significant when we think about space launch, and we did start touching on the green side and the environmental and ethnic and cultural side of space launch, but also on re-entry there is the environmental aspect of it. But accessibility to space, it has become more accessible, but it is still mainly accessible to those with money or those with the right science contacts. And of course there is that limitation of there's only a limited number of launch sites, and therefore there's only a limited number of launches that can be performed during the year. I'd be interesting to see, and one thing I haven't looked at statistically yet, knowing how much more Elon Musk launched over the past 2 years, personally, as well as for all the customers he had contracts with. But if you remove the Starlink launch from his operations, has there been an increase in objects being launched into space, or have Starlink and OneWeb just been that increase? And of course, OneWeb had that hiatus as well during that time. And there's so many parts of what we talk about that points directly to data science and learning more about big data as well. But making more accessible space, more accessible people, what does that mean? And again, you've got a whole spectrum of information on that accessibility, insofar as, you know, to some, space accessibility is the fact that, you know, certain nations own it and it takes big money to do it. Because of course, not forgetting Elon Musk, although he's obviously a billionaire and has the systems and people in place to be able to launch into space, he already also needed those government contracts to be able to do it. So it still is government generated. So maybe on the sustainable development goals, we can work more on supporting indigenous governments to finance their own space launch instead of them paying to be launched or getting free launches on other nations' launches. You know, spreading the spaceports out from the global north, question mark. It just came to mind as I was waffling away. And sustainability is another key element on the whole thing, on the sustainability question on, is the world ending? I think some of this links back into, sorry, I stopped myself short there, but I think some of this actually links back into what we were talking about of generating the understanding, getting the information and understanding out there into general populace. You know, even as our Norse video said, you know, the sky's not falling in yet. As an SSA practitioner, if that's a phrase I can use, an SST practitioner, I have been appalled for a decade on people running around with their hair on fire saying the world is falling in. I have watched the community genuinely worry when Iridium Cosmos collided, and it added 3,000 objects, 3,000 debris objects to a catalog of, maybe there's probably only about 15,000 objects on the catalog at the time, and it immediately added 3,000 objects to that. Well, I won't say it immediately added it to the catalog, it immediately added it into space, and that's 3,000 that we could see, size of a coffee cup or bigger. How many more thousand we don't see is a different equation. And then see the fact, as a tracking practitioner, I was at our Filing Fillingdales as OC operations, arriving in March 2009, so 1 month after Iridium Cosmos. And it wasn't until January 2011 that our US colleagues had succeeded in cataloging all 3,000 plus pieces that had been generated from that collision. So that was almost 2 years after the event that our system was able to keep up with that. I would actually say that we are failing to keep up to the genuine launching right now, but that's a discussion that isn't part of this, and that will get me distracted down in the rabbit hole that maybe you don't want me to go to. And finally, there's probably one of the pieces I'd like to bring up is the adaptability that was discussed about a lot in our discussion. You know, we're talking about utilizing space to support the SDGs. I have an agenda that we should have space as one of the few, have space as one of the sustainment targets of the future. Is that a sustainment development goal, or is that a sustainment goal, I ask? But you know, how do we adapt to any of the new insights and cases throughout the world that are occurring, the various needs? You know, we're very much reactive. How can we make space to be that point where we can become proactive? And that means actually not necessarily utilizing space to support the goals to mitigate the, say, climate change for whatever, but maybe to support goals to invest more money to be proactive in supporting societies to mitigate against future changes rather than reacting to the past. Because I think it was Mark that brought up that wonderful point about all the space data they have in Germany, and yet they failed to be prepared for those horrendous floods they got a few months ago. And I've waffled on enough. So Chris, please save the crowd from my talking.
Dins, I'll tell you something. It is one of the great privileges and pleasures of my work that I get to listen to your wisdom and I get to listen to you speaking, because every time you speak, I learn something. And that was a beautiful summary of what sounds like a fascinating workshop. And I'm only, as I say, I want to apologize to everyone that couldn't be here earlier on. But from my point of view, and taking it down the well, okay, what can we do? What can we do about this? And this is something that I've said a number of times in a number of forums. Law is an answer, but I don't think it is the answer. I think we have regulations in place in countries. We have licensing regimes. That we've got a series of principles in the Outer Space Treaty. All of that should be able to deal with it. What's missing, and it's a point that Lauren's just popped in the chat, that there is a lack of space literacy, certainly amongst policymakers, certainly amongst government, certainly amongst the people deciding what we're going to do with this technology. I think that there are problems. There are things that we can address with space law. I would be talking myself out of a job if I said there weren't. But I think the first question we need to ask is, what is it that we want the laws to do? What is it that we want the treaties to do? And can they be done realistically, given the geopolitics we find ourselves in now? Now, I think on one hand, there are a number of signs of optimism. The Sustainable Development Goals were agreed universally. They've been accepted by every member of the United Nations, and they are now ingrained within the UN fabric. So decisions that are made within the UN across the piece are now referring back to the SDGs. So we now have this common language to talk about sustainable development, to understand what it's going to be doing. And I think that's a really useful tool. So I think of themselves, the SDGs are mechanisms by which we can foster a better shared understanding of what we want. I also think that there is an increasing awareness of the fragility of the space environment. I think that message needs to get pumped out further, but I still think that we've got a nascent awareness that space is fragile, just as the ocean is fragile, just as Antarctica is fragile. And I think that if we can tie in space every time there's an environmental discussion, I would be happy to see that. I don't think the solutions are necessarily the same, but I think the problems of consumption, the problems of overuse, the problems of ignorance, they are all very, very similar discussions that we're having. So I think space can provide that. And I think also space, as Din said, space can provide us with useful information about what the heck's happening. So there's a whole range of reasons to be positive, but equally, there are a number of obstacles that we're going to be facing. Let's see what COP26 produces in terms of concrete results. Everybody here who's been to a space conference will have heard the same carrying cry. We need to act now. We need to act on space debris. And yet there is an alarming lack of action. So there is development, sure. I'm not saying the space community is not responding. I'm saying the governments aren't responding. I'm saying that the organizations that we need to respond are not responding. So I think we need to translate. We've got a fairly good idea of the problems. We've got a fairly good idea of how we need to get there. What we need is to translate that into action. And workshops like this, we set out deliberately the design concept of it with GNOSIS, with DINS, with Lauren, was to build something that was genuinely interactive, that wasn't just a bunch of people saying stuff and we can all nod and go away. It's a plea, really, to say we're going to be producing some outputs, and over the course of the next sort of weeks coming, we're going to see how those outputs can best be heard by people going to COP26. So I think sort of my summary would be, and again, having only jumped in halfway through, is that we need to be creative in our solutions. We need to be collaborative in finding those solutions. And I think one of the reasons that I'm so proud to be working with DINS, but working with GNOSIS, working with Stuart, working with everybody on this, is that we've got some great minds doing this. So with that, I'm going to hand back to DINS, and I hope that was sort of as elegant a summary as one can hope from me.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. And I'm pleased all is good at home, and that you were able to join us for this last part, which, because your insight is always wonderful. The worst thing about Chris and I working together is we just generate more and more work for each other all the time. But hey, that keeps it from everybody else's back, I suppose. But I'd like now to hand over to somebody else who I've known for a long time, a good friend and colleague. I dread to think how many years I've known you for, Stuart, so I won't advertise that too much. But Dr. Stuart Eaves will now present to you on a wonderful project from GNOSIS, the challenges that were announced at the end of the GNOSIS conference. So, Stuart, I shall hand it straight over to you.
Cheers, Dins. Is my screen up okay?
It's come through brilliantly, thank you.
Okay, so this is a very quick presentation. It covers a sort of proactive initiative that GNOSIS has decided to try to encourage people to help us expand the envelope of our ability to measure things in space and hence contribute to the sustainability of the environment. So if you go on the GNOSIS website, you will find that there is a permanently open call, which is available for people with bright ideas that we haven't thought of. But then we thought, well, perhaps we could make it a bit more proactive and actually put some challenges out to the community to actually look at some specific concepts that some of the members of the GNOSIS forum had actually suggested. So the aim, as I say, is to put some challenges out there with some research funding attached and invite people to sort of send us some concepts and do some funded work. They're only intended to be relatively short timescale studies lasting a few months. The only sort of particular limitation that we have is that because of the rules of the GNOSIS grant under which we were sort of founded, the lead organization for the proposal has to come from an STFC institution, so a university or academic entity in the UK, but that doesn't preclude the involvement of industrial partners. They just have to have an STFC institution that they're working with. So at the moment we have 4 technical challenges, and I'll just run through them. This is the first one, which is to look at the feasibility of a space-based infrared instrument for SSA. If you have followed what NASA chose to do with their WISE spacecraft, their Wide Field Infrared Satellite, it was originally purposed to do some quite deep space infrared astronomy, but was then repurposed to have a look at the asteroid belt. And what they found was that the objects in the asteroid belt were quite susceptible to infrared detection. The reason being that asteroids are quite dark and absorb the sun's illumination, and then eventually that energy that they've absorbed gets re-irradiated in the infrared, at which point they are a warm source against a very cold 3 Kelvin background. So we thought that it might be possible to exploit a similar approach to actually detecting debris objects in Earth orbit. We think that the solar illumination will warm them up and that they will be considerably hotter than the background. And so we suggesting a study on an instrument that you could fly probably on a satellite in low Earth orbit that would attempt to do detection of debris objects in the sort of fairly near vicinity, also in low Earth orbit, with the idea of getting a better census of exactly how much stuff is in orbit. As Din's mentioned, you know, following the Iridium Cosmos collision, it took a long time to catalogue the objects that we could track, but we think there's also a lot of objects up there that were too small to track from the surface of the Earth, but going into space may provide us with an advantage. And one of the differences between an infrared sensor in space and one on the surface of the Earth is that you don't have to worry about the atmosphere. We also think that the availability of that sensor would be good because you're now working with the intrinsic heat of the objects that you're trying to detect, so they don't have to be illuminated by the sun. So you could actually operate a satellite all around its orbit and potentially make observations. So there are some parameters here that we think we would like to see investigated in the study. And there's a similar set of parameters associated with the second of our challenges, which is comparable in some ways to the first, in the sense that it's another space-based instrument, but this time one designed to work in the ultraviolet. So this would be a relatively new domain for space situation awareness. As you're probably aware, very little of the ultraviolet light that comes from the sun actually makes it through the atmosphere. We do get suntans, but it's only a very small proportion of the available ultraviolet that gets down to the surface of the Earth. The advantage of a space-based instrument is that potentially we think you might be able to do detection and identification with a physically smaller sensor than you would require in the optical, because you're working with shorter wavelengths. So the instrument itself could potentially be more compact or possibly work at longer ranges, because the resolution wouldn't be as badly affected by distance for a given size of aperture. So we again would like, some work on the instrument design, some thoughts about the CONOPS, thoughts about an appropriate orbit. But there are some specific questions that I think we do need to ask about quite a lot of the population that's in orbit. So existing extant satellites, we have a reasonable idea what they're like because we launched them and we took pictures of them before we launched them. That sort of understanding doesn't apply to a lot of the debris objects because they weren't in the debris state when they were launched. And so we don't know what their area to mass ratio is. We don't know what their reflectivities are. And there are a variety of things that we would want to know if we want to better predict their orbits forward, which this sort of sensor might be able to tell us, so specific information about possibly the area to mass ratio and possibly the materials that the object's made of. So there are, particular applications for this sensor. The third challenge is somewhat different. This is an idea from Don Polacco and his team at Warwick University. So one of the things that they're hoping to do with a derivative of their astronomical system, WASP, is to actually do wide area surveys of the sky and actually track the telescopes at the expected orbital rate of objects in Earth orbit. So as you're probably aware, a lot of the low Earth orbit population is in polar orbit, so it goes either north-south or south-north, and does that at a reasonably predictable rate because the orbit velocities in low Earth orbit are fairly well understood. So if you track the camera across the sky and then add the frames taken from essentially a video feed in an appropriate way, you can stack the light reflected from particular objects into a limited number of pixels on your detector, and then hopefully cross the detection threshold and start to identify smaller stuff than you can see in individual frames. And so this is a particular research activity to actually look at some of the processing technology that would be associated with processing the data from such a telescope concept. And the final technical challenge is another ground-based system, but this time looking at daytime imaging in the infrared. So one of the challenges that we have at the moment, obviously, is that we use radars for stuff in low Earth orbit and mostly telescopes in the optical for tracking stuff in higher orbits. But as you'll know if you've ever spoken to Exoanalytic, the commercial company that's put a whole range of telescopes around the world for tracking stuff in geo, they have a kind of blind period lasting somewhere between 6 and 8 hours centered on local noon, when basically all the telescopes that could see a given satellite are basically in the daytime, and they can't therefore continue to conduct surveillance operations. That limitation potentially could be overcome if you can do imaging in the infrared. So the idea here is to look at the challenge of developing a tracking system capable of working in the daytime. That might involve exploiting the polarization of the light that's coming from the sky. The sky reflection is polarized, and if you could find some other light coming from a satellite that is polarized differently, that might aid discrimination. So there's a number of ways that that particular challenge might be tackled, and that's our fourth challenge. So if you're interested, the way to apply, go to the GNOSIS website, which is on the screen in front of you. I've highlighted with a yellow ring the button that you need to click on the website to find the funding routes. And then there's a very simple expression of interest form, which is basically, your contact details so that we can talk to you, and then simply submit your proposal. And it doesn't have to be long. There are some kind of word limits associated with it, and I hope you'll find that those number of words is relatively small and not too taxing to put together. So fingers crossed, there may be some people out there who would be prepared to rise to the challenge, and I'll stop at that point and take any questions that you have. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Are there any questions out there from the audience? If not, you're able to get hold of Stuart through GNOSIS, and is there a direct link to you on the webpage, Stuart, or is it just a case of responding to the webpage challenges and then you pick it up?
Sorry, Din's talking to a muted microphone. There is a contact us function on the website that people can use if they want to ask questions about the nature of the challenges and whether certain ideas are in or out of scope. But as I tried to point out at the beginning, these challenges have some particular objectives, but there is also an open challenge for people to bring their own ideas. So it's just a question of formulating any response appropriately, and we can then potentially channel funding into a research activity.
Now you got me talking to a muted mic as well. It must be the length of the day. That's great to know, Stuart. And anybody on here who think, well, actually the challenges are too technical for me or whatever else, don't forget, if you know of people, just get the word out on the street. It's a great opportunity to receive funding from effectively from SDFC to be able to then do more support and work for long-term space sustainability more than anything else. I'm just getting a bit confused here. Chris, do you have the controls for the screen, for screen share? Fiona will be presenting next, and I don't think she's able to take control at the moment.
I'll have a look, and if not, Fiona, if you just send me the slides, I'll run them for you, but I will try and give you the control.
Give me the control.
Yeah, I'd say I've got the slides as well, Chris. So unless there's any other questions, Stuart, thank you very much for your presentation. Everybody do reach into the GNOSIS website to be able to access and apply for those or ask questions about those challenges. And right now we're sorting out control of space for somebody.
This might be an appropriate time just to have a little 5-minute break if you want to go and, take a comfort break, grab a cup of drink of water, something like that, and we'll come back at say 5 past. Sorry.
I won't be speaking for very long. Don't run away, people. Get a glass of wine. Is it 5 o'clock? Cup of tea.
Fantastic.
There's always 5 o'clock somewhere. I'll pause.
And also, I do field work with laser comms instrument scientists and astronomical observatories. And depending on what nationality they are, it depends on how they talk about the sky. So I was really lucky to go to Galileo's house in Florence, where they were holding some talks. So my colleagues won't mind me saying this, so the Italian astronomers, we talk about philosophy and Galileo and go back to talk about astrolabes, and because they are trained, there's a link between the history and astronomy and astrophysics. And in the UK, it's very much astrophysics, very sophisticated. And then in the US as well, this is the issue when you hear people talking across the different continents, you keep talking about astronomy, and it's actually very different depending which country you're in. In the US, it's more linked to traditional astronomy as well as astrophysics. But it makes a massive difference in how people frame and discuss the details, especially the technology.
So Fiona, the book you want is Accessory to War, The Unspoken Alliance Between Astrophysics and the Military by Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Oh yes, okay, thank you. Are you?
On that note, it's time to introduce you, and I shall let you introduce yourself to those that don't know you, but introduce you to the audience.
Let me hear.
No, you still have a team of 14 waiting with bated breath. So for all your non-glittering or lots of glittering but isn't gold. Over to you, Fiona.
Okay, congratulations to everyone who's made it this far. I will not take very long. I've tried to make it where I've either highlighted topics that you may have mentioned or I've added ideas that you haven't. It's just supposed to kickstart any discussion, extra discussion you want to do. I'm going to tend to focus upon a bit of the work that I do. So I've called it All That Glitters Are Not Gold, the darker side of satellites and UNSDGs. I'm based in astrophysics, but I mean actually in instrumentation. CAs, I'm in extragalactic and cosmology, and I'm something called a SPAN fellow, linked to the space network that'll start on the 1st of November. But I'm not a physicist. I'm an ecologist, an anthropologist. I've worked in 9 other disciplines, so I know a little bit, know a little bit about different things. So I've also worked in human geography, geophysics. So what I want to do today is just to go through some of the issues of what I think are the darker sides that aren't always discussed, because satellites, the work of satellites when I worked in geography was just ignored. And I understand now where there's a total love-in for satellites. And I think it's gone too much the other way. So I just want to sort of like raise a few questions. So there, Stuart kindly also picked from the different orbits that if you want to learn more about satellites, I don't know your background, so forgive me if I tell you things that you know really well. The different orbits make a massive difference to exactly what's going on. So I do love satellites. Some of them can be useful. Now, forgive the small writing, it's to remind me to say they are basically transport vehicles. With sensors, cameras, receivers, depends upon the sensitivity. It's a tool, they are tools. They are beautiful tools. Earth observations with geology have been doing work for decades. It's really established. And then there's a new area, is Tanau here, which is, they're doing work on space-based sats for solar energy. So I also work in the environmental field. So this actually does worry me, capturing solar energy, but Tanau can talk about that, and focusing down on Earth. We've also got anti-satellite weapons testing that's big in the news just now. That's another where they actually are continuing to physically blow up satellites. Now, that's more Dinsy's area, so I'll let him talk about it. I can send you information about it. People are quite concerned. And this whole area is increasing with new space in tandem with concern over national security of space assets. Space, as Stuart and people talk about, is complex, it's unknown, it's diverse, and everything is a trade-off. Absolutely everything. So I'm going to go through this quickly. I know Din said I was an ethicist, which is one of the areas I work at. My stuff is very applied. It's about shining a light on hidden issues. It's about annoying people by asking, but why do you do it that way? And is it an urban myth? And are you sure that's what you're doing? And I'm really interested in just keeping conversations going. It's not about what's right necessarily wrong, and I like nuance, I like detail. So I don't know why it's doing these strange. So the first thing I want to say to people is, what do you mean by sustainability? So I come from environmental. I spent like 10, 20 years. My PhD was about land. I was trained as an ecologist. And the concept of sustainability for me, you're comparing outer space or space with the blue planet. I've compared space debris to garbage. Is why do you, unlike Chris, I'm like, how can you compare these two areas? What do you mean? So the example I've got is space debris in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which people who've heard the other talk have heard me talk about. So there are similarities. It's human-made, debris is really old, it's non-biodegradable. Interestingly, it's really difficult to measure, locate, track both the garbage patch. You can't use satellite imagery, there's millions of swirling particles. People talk about the tragedy of the commons, which to me is a Western economic concept. It's problematic that you think that the idea is in order to solve problems, you have to own it. You have to have responsibility. You have to lay down laws. You've got the state sustainability rating that's just been developed, which concerns me. I worked on the fair trade criteria in forestry. It's still based upon Western concepts. The people that are still talking are based in the US or ESA. And you had to be in the room or the right conference to be invited in to be involved in it. I understand it's a great initiative, but the question behind it is, is it actually going to be useful? And at the bottom, well, I'll get to that in a minute. The difference is, for me, between space and our blue planet, there are no rainbow warriors there. I know we have space environmentalists like Marie Bajar, but they're within the organizations. There's no self-funded innovators. To get to space, people have already mentioned it, it's by invitation only. And is it anything like a human habitat, an ecosystem? All the work I've done, sustainability of what, right? Sustainability in space, for me, I'm playing devil's advocate. It's about keeping the roads open for the most dominant spacefaring nations. Is that what we're carrying on doing? Sustainability on the Earth is very complex, but it is about, it's far more than keeping the roads open. And I do want to say new space, people keep saying space is the same. It's very different, this new space that's moving in. It's also complex. It's very different from the world of stargazing nations that I work with hunter-gatherers I'll speak about, and it's very different from marine. I work with marines and astronomy and astrophysics. The key thing about new space is that it's being funded. They're looking for markets to fund ideas. So at the end of the day, the economic benefits have to often be turned around quite quickly in order to appease the shareholders. I am generalizing. So the other thing I look at is commercial vertical launch spaceports. Now, interestingly, these spaceports actually work between the two. They work between the ground-based environment and the space. And at the moment, the environmental impact assessment, they're excellent, the people that have gone and done them, but the regulations are from ground-based to the nation airspace. They do not go any further. It's about mitigation. It's not about enhancement for nature at all. Almost all the small spaceports are in rural, often fragile environments. For example, in Scotland and in Andøya in Norway, they're on peat bogs. And as a forester, an ecologist, these are areas that normally have to be kind of protected, and we have problems in Scotland with them planting lots of trees on them. European Space Agency has looked at life cycle of satellites, but it stops once it's in space. There's nothing beyond there. I'm just touching on a few issues. So I've put in the light pollution for mega constellations and astrophysics because Lauren, she talked about, I was at the dark skies, but I have to say, this is only for full sky optical surveys. There's lots of astrophysics it does not affect, and it's for radio astronomy. And my colleagues are going to love me when I say this, but can you just mitigate it? My colleague James Osborne is doing work on actually modeling the movement of the satellites, so then you can schedule the telescopes. Is it enough? Is astrophysics, is it just a trade-off? Is it a vanity project? And people keep talking about the Kepler syndrome, which in itself is problematic because it's quite sensationalist. So my question is, not that I necessarily agree, because I actually think astrophysics is incredibly important. But, you know, so what? So what? You can't do full skeptical service in radio astronomy. And then I want to talk, somebody talked about colonial. So I come from development studies as well. So I want to talk about the colonial space applications on Earth. There is this push to, they're saying everything that's going up into space is going to help the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, some of the areas that I worked with, is it compatible with what's happening on the ground? So one of the constant things people talk to me about is e-health. They'll say there's a small rural community and they don't have any doctors. You know, we can zoom down, we can get a doctor somewhere to give information and knowledge to that small rural community. So I did a lot of work on e-health and consultation. So the question that you always have is that e-health was developed for, the top here you've got for military. It was for people that were literally about to die. So you zoomed in, you had a specialist going in, they were just trying to save their lives. It's also used in the next one between health professionals that know each other, talking about different aspects. It may be done more face-to-face with the patient, but this idea that you are treating a patient, unless it's absolute basic necessities, is very difficult through health. In France, it's illegal. You can't see a patient virtually unless you've met them face to face. And the question is, where's the knowledge being held? So you're giving a consultation to another nation, a small rural community, but does that mean then you don't train doctors? You don't train local communities? That's what's been one of the issues with is that you can connect from other countries, is that then people feel no need to train up local community workers. There is also a big push to remove all of senses in healthcare. So it's all about sight. That in itself is problematic because health professions use all their senses. And this has also led to not just about in resource poor nations, but also telemedicine and e-health was actually developed for astronauts. The concept behind it was astronaut, you have the flight surgeon, they know each other incredibly well on ground. The astronaut knows their body, flight surgeon knows their family, knows everything about them. And when they went into space, the idea was that they would just be able to communicate. This has been rolled out, satellite e-health has been rolled out into all prisons in Texas, where I did field work for about 6 months. So the patients don't see, the prisons see no doctor face to face. And it's seen as successful because it saves money. And they've also rolled it out in Brixton Prison in the UK. So you get space applications on Earth. I worked in agriculture and forestry. Is the intention of the satellites actually going to fit on to what's happening on the ground? You know, you still have to question the underlying values. So there's work done with agriculture, wonderful work done with agriculture, with satellites looking at droughts, movement of water, et cetera, et cetera. But the question is the current agricultural practice on the ground actually beneficial for the Earth? Are we perpetuating patterns of agriculture that continues to take the nutrients out of the soil? And then the other one is at the bottom, this is in Colombia, is I trained with the head of forestry in Colombia, and his work was all about finding alternative crops for small farmers up in the hills. And there's been a new satellite application that's come in where they're trying to identify, they can identify illegal crops. Now that is criminalizing the small farmers on the ground. And the people on the ground will say, well, we know where the illegal crops are. We don't need the satellites to tell us that. What we need to do is to change the cartels. So there's a mismatch between the values of the satellite projects. And then finally, space applications on Earth. There's a lot of work on mapping land rights. So I worked with hunter-gatherers in Papua New Guinea many, many years ago. And you can't actually map, you can't use a lot of satellites with some of the rainforest Papua New Guinea, it's just too thick. But what they were doing was mapping out who owned which was the land using a Western concept of the land. And they created a massive land conflict because actually different people came forward to claim rights on the land that because nobody actually owned one set of land, there was different use rights over different times. And I do want to finish by saying, you know, what's so great about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? They're massive. questions about this. It's United Nations, it's based upon free market economy. It's not really proved itself. I sit on the fence with this, but I certainly can give anybody who's interested some quite detailed researches in economics that are challenging the whole concept of sustainable development goals. So I don't know if I've got a final slide. Nope, I didn't. So thank you very much.
Fiona, thank you very much. That's a huge amount of food for thought. And I know that if anybody else is like me, there's just thinking about different aspects of that. Some very critical questions that you touched upon, and very significant questions. And I'd just like to go back and reflect on one of your slides where you talked about.
Do you want me to keep the slides up?
Yeah, if you could. You were talking about the number of number of satellites. Oh, it's been a long day. And the can the astronomers work around them? Can they find gaps in the flow, etc., to be able to take pictures of the stars or whatever they need? And that's a very good question. And it just made me think of an experience of mine as a military space tracking operator. And the UK Space Operations Centre provide a service called Satellite Warning Service, and they have done. They did long before I stumbled into this space realm when I was an air defender, and you would receive notifications from an organisation. It wasn't the Spock in those days because it didn't exist. That would give you warnings about when nefarious satellites were to overfly any exercises you were doing or any operations you were doing that you might want to hide from them. And so then you had windows of opportunity where you could do your maneuvers or whatever it was you were doing. And it was known as a satellite warning service. And I know they still provide it now. Now, when I first stumbled into space in 1999, so I wasn't launched, I stumbled into space. They could predict all this information very, very easily. And it was a case of these are the big windows of opportunity for you to do whatever you're doing, because there were so few, for want of a better phrase, spy satellites they knew about that were flying over. I went off, did a number of tours in other fields and areas, came back a decade later, and that warning service had changed from here are the windows of opportunity to it's very hard to find any windows, because now we've got X amount of satellites that are Earth observation, X amount of spy satellites that are electronic RF listening, etc., etc. So now it was a case of which specific areas were you operating in, which specific wavelengths, or what you was doing was it going to be affected by, how effectively looking more intricately in how to hide, because there were so many military satellites of so many different kinds overflying the globe all the time that there was no more windows. And I fear with the march of the mega constellations, and quite interestingly, we've been able to use the mega constellation phrase, which I know has been balked at by many people recently, but with the march of the mega constellations, that we will actually be obscuring it, and we may recompense sight by therefore there's only so many satellites that aren't reflective anymore or whatever, but actually they're still going to be transmitting, and therefore we will be blocking out the radio astronomy and completely defeating what they're doing. So if it's not managed, I'll go back to space traffic management now, it will go unchecked, and therefore the pollution will far outstrip the needs or the terrestrial bound capabilities that are trying to work around them at the moment.
Yeah, but who cares about astronomy?
Well, I wasn't going to say that, not knowing if we had any astronomers left in the audience or not, but that's a good question. I
think astrophysics is
yeah.
When I went into it 4 years ago, I was supposed to be doing something on microscopes and ended up, sorry, Michael, and now my view of it's very, very different. I think it's Michael, is that right? I can't see people's names, sorry.
Fiona, I raised that issue in one of my comments earlier, and I'm actually doing a talk for the Royal Institution on Friday, and it's one of the things that I'll be mentioning there. The need for some sort of balance between the needs of the astronomy community and the needs of the space industry. I think we have to try and find that balance, because we need both.
And it's not all of the astronomy community. It's only full sky optical astronomers. and radio. I think the radios, again, I spend a lot of time listening and trying to draw together different ideas, and I think the impact upon radio might be far more.
I'm talking about radio astronomy, infrared astronomy, and optical astronomy, all of which potentially could be impacted.
Only wide full sky surveys and optical, though, because it's only at sunrise.
I didn't challenge that point.
Yeah, they don't. Well, see, I have to go back. Sorry, am I chairing myself? I can see it's Michael, isn't it? I can't see everyone's hands, so could you?
Yeah, it's hard when you're sharing the screen, I must
So
admit.
Michael's got his. Is Michael, isn't it?
Yeah. I've got my hand up.
It's because I can't see your name. Sorry, I know he's got his hand up. Stuart, I think that's a really it's a good point. But the more the nature of the work I do is I have to go back to my colleagues and begin to ask more and more questions, and then I realize, okay, it's not everything. Anyway, Michael, sorry.
That was brilliant, wonderful. Thanks so much. I learned a huge amount, and it's great that people are asking all these hard questions and pointing out that satellites are sometimes a problem for the environment as well as being a solution. My question was whether you think there are enough of a problem to interest your average environmentalist. So you mentioned that there are no external rainbow warriors. There are some space environmentalists or people who call themselves space environmentalists, but they tend to be people within the community.
I mean, they care. They do
Pardon me?
work. Sorry, on you go.
And so I wondered, where does this issue of space fit into the broader environmentalist movement, say in the UK, perhaps globally at the moment? Is it about to become an important issue for ordinary environmentalists?
Coming from originally from the environmental world, there's a lot of conflicting narratives, right? So it depends who you're speaking to. And I'm going to generalize here, right? So I find that people on the ground doing environmental work, right? So I used to look at LIDAR, and I'm coming from forestry, used to ask people who would say, oh, we can track this. We can track this phenomenon. I know, what is it you're looking at? Tell me, I'm a nerd. And in the end, they said, we can, and I said, no, what is the sensor doing? Because I'm a visual anthropologist, so what's it? And in the end, they said, oh, it's chlorophyll, it's the shift of chlorophyll. I'm like, right, okay. So I know where that will and won't work. And there seems to be a mismatch a misunderstanding between the different communities. So on the ground, I am generalizing, I apologize, all the environmentalists who know the details, they don't really get the kit. They don't ask enough questions. They think that the satellites just can see everything, and which you can't. And then they got people, and the satellites don't understand the ecology. So there is this often whoosh, whoosh, and then when I speak to them individually, some of the people working with sensors, because it's not the satellites, it's as Stuart will say, it's the sensors, it's the cameras, it's the thing that the satellite's carrying. And I'll say, do you think that they think it's it's like a panacea? And they go, yeah, I think a bit. And I said, well, why don't you challenge them? And they say, I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to, because I don't really understand. So I hope this is not too long an answer, but in all the different work, there's a lot of misunderstandings and gaps. And I think that that's what interests me, is trying to kind of weave together different ideas that are rigorous and not just urban myths, because there's a lot of urban myths. I repeat them. I say things to my colleagues and they go, well, that's completely wrong for you. And I'm like, oh, is that? And then they tell me things, and then I give it to somebody else. I kind of throw a lot of the knowledge around like a ball, and somebody goes, well, that doesn't make any sense. So slowly I managed to work it down. So I think there's a slightly anti-satellite approach to some of the environmentalists, and it's hugely frustrating if you're working on the ground. Like, say, for example, you're working with small farmers or growing cocoa because they've got no money, no food, and then they heard all this money is going towards a satellite project that is going to identify all the illegal crops. So there's that frustration, I think, maybe, an unwillingness to work. together, maybe. Don't know, it depends.
Yeah,
Full stop.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for that answer. I guess I was asking a slightly different question, which is in the broader environmental movement. Is this whole question of satellites actually on people's radar? So when I speak, occasionally I speak to environmentalists about space and light pollution and satellites and such things, and usually the response is a shrug or indifference. And the argument is usually there are enough problems, environmental problems on Earth to worry about. Why should I go to a protest on light pollution? I don't even know if there are protests against light pollution, but why should I go to such a thing rather than to say a protest on climate change?
Well, no, that's, I mean, I was sitting in an environment, it's like, who cares? But there's other reasons that satellites are important, especially space debris. There is definitely, I mean, everyone was saying this, there's not enough of information. But for me, sometimes everyone uses the Kepler syndrome. So stop it. So the environmental world 30, 40 years ago did the same thing, scared everybody. Nobody listened. And I think the space community, I'm generalizing, is doing the same thing. Every time they talk about, oh, everything's going to blow up. And you're like, oh, there's other reasons that you want to care. And sometimes the outreach, it dumbs everything down.
But the other reasons don't necessarily build your business case for a government to invest into your large satellite constellation.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
You're pulling the cynical strings out of me there, Fiona.
No, it's true. It's true because I sat in the, whoever's in the Dark Sky conference, right? So I sat in the Dark Skies conference last week and really enjoyed it. But the week before I was in the European Space Agency, and it was industrial clean days for 4 days. And it was about space debris solution. It was really, some of the engineering was elegant. It was absolutely beautiful. And I heard people and the astronomer just criticizing the space industry, the operators. And I thought, well, actually, that's not true. That's, like, I had a chat with like the former CEO of Virgin Galactic. They care. Now, whether their values are the same as mine, but sometimes people don't appreciate the barriers. I mean, Stuart and you can talk about this, yourself, is that there seems to be like this polarized view of, and nobody was there from ESA. Nobody was there. And half the questions that are being asked had already been done in a completely different field. So what I do see is the same in the environmental field. When I worked in it and I left it, was just the setting up arguments. We're very good at talking and not listening. It's just so little listening. Michael?
Oh, sorry, that's a legacy hand. I did have other questions, but I'll leave the floor to others.
I can't see anybody else's hand. If some do.
There's Lauren Lee Hallett put a couple of points in the chat. She's gone, unfortunately. She had to leave. She put a couple of points into the chat. I'll read through the first one maybe, and then Michael can come back with his questions if nobody else has any. And a first piece, and I know you can all read it, but I'll read it anyway because it's good to think on that, is in the logic of the space sector being an ecosystem where every actor has to participate and work in concert to advance the issue, i.e. sustainability of space activities. We should not forget the problem of data storage. Satellites provide amounts of data that most of us cannot even apprehend. To store even a small percentage of this data requires facilities. She's obviously thinking the size of Google, which quite rightly, that consume tremendous amounts of energy. So we should start addressing the problem of finding sustainable ways to store satellite data. One way to go that way is to raise commercial awareness. Startups seem to think the next breakthrough is in micro launchers or small satellite constellations. But if we provide incentives such as financial competition, etc., we can increase the brain power taking care of that problem. She's absolutely right, actually.
Can I answer that then?
Please do.
I would say, why is there so much data?
Do we need all that data?
Do we need it? Right, it's petabytes of it. Healthcare is the same when I worked in healthcare. So people are saying we need to do this. I agree with her, but my interest is going further back and going, why have you got so much data? Why are you gathering it all? Like, what are you going to do with it? Like, are you just doing it in healthcare? It is unbelievable the amount of data that's collected. I work a lot with images, videos, and I can't do anything with them because I'm not allowed to. So they're not even, they're just locked away somewhere else. But the question is, yeah, why? It's petrified. I mean, what's amazing about the space world, astrophysics really, more, I think, than satellites, is that they are dealing with vast amounts of data in a way that we've never experienced before. But they're not. I mean, okay, so the cosmologists I work with who do like huge simulations of the universe, you know, they run computers for like 35, 40 days to do like one simulation. You know, their ability to deal with the data, but a lot of it is, it's just, it disappears. It's not even stored. So, Stuart, what do you think about the data?
Well, there's clearly a lot of it about, and one of the challenges that I think the space surveillance community faces, it's not just about the data that's collected by satellites and then returned to the ground. We also have the challenge looking the other way. If you think about the size of the catalogue that we have at the moment, it's 20-odd thousand objects larger than 10 centimetres that are routinely tracked. The new space fence and the radars that Leo Labs are developing are going to get down to 1 to 2 centimetre sized objects, and it depends who you ask exactly how big that catalogue is, but NASA's estimate is 500,000 objects and ESA's estimate is nearly 1 million, I think. So clearly we're going up at least a couple of orders of magnitude in terms of the number of things that we're tracking.
But this is only space debris data.
Well, it's debris and the mega constellation satellites, but then the further computational challenge that you face is even if you can develop a catalogue that succeeds in handling all of those objects, the challenge then is to try and do conjunction warnings for all of those objects, and the probability calculations go roughly as the number of objects squared, with the result that you're looking at, sort of very large increases in the amount of effort that you're going to have to put in order to do the conjunction warnings with that larger catalogue. So yeah, we do face some computational challenges, I think, in both directions.
And space debris is only one aspect of all the data that's been gathered from space, from the observation, from, I mean, the idea behind like the Earth observation in the up in the Arctic, it's been established there. They've had a long time to work out how to use the data, how to analyze it, how to develop the human skills, the knowledge, how to store. They're probably the most advanced. But the idea now is that, like before, when projects were put up into space, so I am at, like space debris is one aspect of lots and lots and lots of different data that's being used. So there are, like going back to Michael's question, it depends which area you're looking at is whether particularly the data may or may not be useful. Some of it is blue sky, you need blue sky thinking, right? I mean, some of it is not even about data storage, whether or not you cannot do it, right? So there's work being done on human trafficking. I would absolutely think it would be a most amazing application to be able to track people being trafficked. Now, I've been told by colleagues who work on sensors, they say, you can't do it. It's too small. It's the window's too small. I don't know if that's true because technology gathers.
Depends if you believe the myths or not of 24 or the American national spy agencies or whatever else like that, and what capabilities. I mean, the rumors I heard that they've effectively handed or operate satellites which are as powerful as Hubble, but instead of looking out to space, these satellites looking from space down to Earth. So what they pick up is beyond. It's that wonder of if we actually spent our time funding this technology for the good rather than funding the technology for national security interests, we'll give it that phrase, then we might actually, because actually the good isn't that national security interest, then we might actually have more support for more data of good use that we can utilize to support what we're doing.
The other thing is about the satellites that are being sent up into space, right? So when NASA or the other nations did it, you had to put an argument in for what was the purpose of that mission. You had to do it because it was national, because it was national funded. You know, in the UK, everything's funded by taxpayers in astrophysics. So you had to put it. Now, whether or not the argument was, you know, was a valid one is another discussion. But the point is, you had to put in an argument. I'm not completely sure now that's what you have to do, because it's kind of like, yay, great, let's just throw a satellite up, because satellites can do anything whatsoever. And some of them do wonderful work, there's no doubt whatsoever. But even that's been a shift into new space. Is why are you doing that? Why are you, you know, and somebody said, well, we're not going to stop sending satellites up. And I'm like, well, why? Well, why not? Like,
yeah, that was,
what makes you think that you can?
There was something from a presentation I saw 8 years ago where they talked about the fact that if we stop, they talked then that if we stop launching, then the debris we did have, this is a theoretical paper, the debris we did have would continue to collide, but the pieces would obviously get smaller and smaller, and then within a certain amount of time, and I can't remember the amount of time they reckoned, the pieces would be so small they would no longer be a worry, and therefore you could then start launching again without worrying about debris. And to go back to that, the figures, the stats on objects in space, we keep on getting told about the space debris apocalypse, and there are 500,000, 900,000, or whatever number of objects smaller than 1 centimeter and above in space. In fact, they talk about 1 millimeter and above 129 million, and it's all worked out through modeling. But in my view, the so what is, well, we're not taking out satellites on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis, not even annual basis. So does it really matter how many tiny bits there are in space traveling at such speed? Because it doesn't seem to be affecting the satellites we've got at the moment. But that's another aside. Rather than hogging the floor, I'll also read the second piece from Lauren, which is really good and links into very much to your so what question at the end as well. So we talked about geopolitics and the fact that it's never been that easy to access space. One challenge for sustainability is desires of national autonomy in accessing space. Obviously, space has always been a domain used to further national interest. But I feel like every time I go through a new national space policy, one emphasis on strategic autonomy, sovereignty in space, etc. She's absolutely right. I'm wondering how we will be able to reconcile those increasing nationalistic plans and the principle of free and equitable access to space with the necessity to make space sustainable. She rightly says, do we need 50 micro launchers? Do we need 50 mega constellations? So it's probably a good point is the so what and the so why. I mean, if you look at a lot of the rhetoric within our so-called national space strategy that the UK has just published, they talk a lot about on-orbit servicing, on-orbit manufacture. Actually, what we're doing is we're talking about clearing those roads, as you mentioned, Fiona, so that we can do more things on space because we haven't got room to do it on Earth anymore.
But for who?
Those nations that can.
Exactly. Nothing changes. Sustainability of the same hierarchies. So we are sustaining. And the other thing you'll find is people in space, so in environmental studies, we talk about conservation, not preservation. Preservation means putting something in aspect, doesn't move, doesn't shift. And conservation is much more about being dynamic, it shifts, it moves. And I keep seeing the word preservation coming up again and again in the space rhetoric, which makes me think that they're not, preserving what? Michael's put his hand up. You're so much more polite than me. I just talk.
You're the speaker and the chair.
I should,
I wanted to ask about where do you think the humanities fits into all of this? So my impression, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that this whole issue of space sustainability, I don't want to offend anyone here, it has mainly been taken up by people in the space industry and scientists without that much input from, say, historians or philosophers or ethnographers, with some brilliant exceptions. And I know that at Warwick, we do have something called the environmental humanities, but it's all about climate change, and everyone wants to talk about the Anthropocene. They don't want to talk about the Astrocene. And insofar as they talk about space, it's usually a way of talking indirectly about the Earth. So am I right in all those impressions, do you think? And if I'm right, are there ways of getting the humanities more interested in this kind of topic?
I think Warwick actually has the ideal opportunity for that. Don Palaco in his new Space Domain Awareness, or is it Center for Space Domain Awareness or Space Domain Awareness Center? Sounds like the ideal organization that can start, that should be drawing in the humanities to bring them into the conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm involved in Habitability. So this is a research network at the University of Warwick, which has me as a historian, someone from film studies, and also people from physics and astronomy, David Armstrong, an astronomer working under Don. So we have the infrastructure there. It's just a matter of generating wider interest in fields like history or philosophy. I mean, I have thoughts of my own about how to do that, but I wondered what you think, Fiona.
So my experience is I've had to just relinquish any concept of, I mean, I can't get funding. I have actually just, the SPAN Fellowship is really kind of unique because for that, I'm actually representing space exploration and talking about the space strategy. But that's taken me a long time. I've moved, so I've learned, I speak in different ways. So I'm trained in business and in college. So I'm like a chameleon. And sadly, you know, so, and I also get, I'll be really honest now, so I get really frustrated at social researchers that I study because they will say, they never listen to us. And I'm like, well, but I'm not, are you listening to them? And I find that I have to read a lot of papers and learn a lot of languages, and there's a reason I'm in astrophysics. It's my favorite discipline. And I still consider myself a human geographer. And when I started my fieldwork, everyone thought I'd go into anthropology. And I said, I'm an ethnographer. I need to be in the astrophysics. And I haven't got a clue what they're talking about. I used to sit, I had no idea, didn't do physics, didn't do maths. So I could talk to you one-to-one actually, rather than, sorry, because it's quite a long discussion about the view. And as I move disciplines, I know it's set in, academia is set in silos, people think in silos, they talk in silos. Funding is the same. I can sit with engineers. I used to say to, I still say to people, I'm not a physicist. And then they talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old. So then I don't say I'm a physicist, and they show me all the formulas, and eventually I go, I got a clue, I don't know what that is.
You've got interactional expertise, as Harry Collins would say. You're doing
yes, Harry Collins, interactional expertise.
You're doing STS, Science and Technology Studies. You could be at the Edinburgh School of Science and Technology Studies.
I used to be in STS and ran away from it screaming.
Oh, why?
That's another conversation for anybody who wants to talk
love to have
about it. Again, they're silos, they're expertise, there's just this thing of, if we don't listen to each other. So I wrote about this is going up. This is in my philosophy. This guy called Hans Georg Gadamer that I write about, and I include.
I think that's a really good, good point on which to bring the discussion to a close. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
I think it's I think that's kind of the whole theme of what we've been discussing is that disciplines need to listen to other disciplines. There needs to be that total conversation. We need to reach out from beyond our space community to the people who are making decisions, to the people who are able to influence the decisions, to the voters, to people who are going to put these people in office. This has been a rich and fascinating discussion, and I've really enjoyed. I would imagine that there's so many more conversations that are firing off in everybody's head. And one of the things that I hope we can do in some ways to keep this discussion going and to keep the conversations going, because we need to be having this, and we need to be thinking about the way in which space is used for everyone. Because at the minute, I agree with you, Fiona, I don't think anything's changing. I think, and more than that, I actually think what we're seeing is a retrenchment into, two large superpowers promoting their interests and making sure that space is a closed shop. And I think that's something that we can't really allow to happen. hopefully we have the mechanisms and the tools to do that. And hopefully we can use the shared languages of the Sustainable Development Goals to try and keep the door ajar. So Dins, with your permission, I think we can bring the workshop to a close with a thank you to absolutely everybody. This is one of those occasions where we can't really thank the speakers because everybody's been a speaker and everybody's been involved. And Fiona, thank you very much for that last real thought-provoking discussion there. To everybody who's been involved, this has been absolutely vital. There will be outputs for this. We will keep you informed as to what those outputs are going to look like. And so Dins, I think over to you, sir.
So all the material will go onto the GNOSIS website in the very near future. I have all but Elaine's slides, so I'll be able to pass them all on to the network to get them onto the website, so they'll be there through the event. Could I please ask everybody that's left, and we'll send out an email to those that attended, to go onto the website, onto the event workshop, and to respond to the questionnaire at the end, please. Your responses do help us improve what we're doing at GNOSIS and help us look to the future, and more importantly, any ideas of what to discuss for the future or research topics. That's the whole aim, is to keep this discussion and other discussions going. Hopefully COP26 will take note of the significance of space to its needs, but also, more importantly, in my view, to the significance of ensuring the sustainability of space, for whatever reason we might want that for. I'd like to thank those that are still with us that spoke today as presenters, and more importantly, those that participated. It's been a great discussion, as always, and the audience has been far different to some of the ones we've experienced from the past, probably less technical, which has been good. We need to drag more of the technical guys back into this humanities-based discussion, and make sure the two work on together. Yeah, thank you very much for your time. Unless anybody has any other questions, I shall stop recording and stop sharing fairly soon. Thank you again. And
can I say one thing?
Please do, Fiona.
Very, very quickly. Okay, so I'm on some COP26 panel about inclusion and tools and technology. I'm gonna send everyone an email because I quite like to get different people's ideas or work involved in it. So that's on the 9th of November. I just would much rather use that kind of space to sort of bring in different ideas. So send me an email. I'm at Durham. You can easily find me with my weird name, and I'll send out an email. I'm just doing it as a reminder for anybody who's got sort of thinks about inclusion, access to technology and tools. Any examples that you've got, it'd be brilliant to use, and I will credit you. I will not put it under my name, or maybe I will.
No, but that's brilliant, Fiona. Thank you very much for that. Send anything your way. You can take the credit for it. Don't worry about it. But no, that's fantastic, and good luck with that. I'm pleased that you're on a panel on COP26. That is great. So let's hope.
It's just millions of them, aren't there?
Yeah, I forgot to include on the slide the tongue-in-cheek meme I've seen of the Tesla with its own generator, because apparently some of the stuff they're hosting at COP26, they don't have enough EV points for all the vehicles they've brought in to drive all the dignitaries around. So the irony of that is I mean, I did see the fact that the security cordons have cordoned off most of the EV points for the event. So most people that want to go there, environmentally friendly, may not be able to get there. But there we go. Anyway, that's an aside. Thank you very much for everybody's time. It's been a great discussion. Please don't hesitate to contact any of us through either GNOSIS or our own contacts, which should all be available on the website through the presentations, etc., because it'd be great to continue this conversation at any time, and great to be able to draw in any other experience and thoughts people might have. It's a shame some people have already left us, and hopefully they will link in with us again, because they've all left some great thoughts and suggestions in the chat panel, which I've saved and will be added to the record along with everything else. So thank you once again. Chris, do you have anything else to say?
Just to thank you, as always, for brilliant, thought-provoking words, for your summaries, for keeping the whole thing running, and for covering for me earlier on. Thanks so much, sir.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Have a nice evening.